Hello everyone, and welcome to the season and series debut of Grappling with Canada. For those of you who are familiar with my work from the Six-Sided podcast, and for those of you getting to know me for the very first time, I am your host, the Taxman. This month's episode will be covering Canadian wrestling icon and legend, Stu Hart. Now, there's no way that I'd be able to cover the topic of Stu Hart simply on my own, so I've brought some very special guests along with me for the ride today. You're going to hear about the early life and times of Stu Hart with wrestling. Oh, goddamn, she does everything from writing, blogging, YouTube, Twitch, whatever. You can find her everywhere. The very beautiful and talented Ashley Rose Nova. To give us the promoter's perspective side of the program, I have with me Canadian Wrestling Elite's very own Hotshot Danny Duggan. And the man who wrote legitimately the Bible on Stampede Wrestling, a man who spent an exorbitant amount of time with the Hart family and really gives an important and in-depth peek behind the curtain of what was transpiring with the Harts, with Stampede Wrestling. Like I said, the man who wrote the Bible on Stampede Wrestling, Mr. Heath McCoy. In addition to the fantastic guests that I've rounded out for today's program, I'm also going to be including some classic audio from CBC, from Stampede Wrestling, and some classic interviews itself. And we are going to get into all of that on the other side of this.
Hey everybody, Trent from Total Nonstop Impact. Impact Talk for Impact fans, the #1 Impact Wrestling podcast and discussion show on the planet. Tuesday night post shows after Impact and Access TV. Thursday night TNA Asylum throwbacks. Sunday night Impact Plus Weekly Explosion Talk and Open Forum. All the pay-per-views in between and the breaking news. Whatever's happening in Impact Wrestling, we're covering it. Join us at Total Nonstop Impact at twitch.tv/Total Nonstop Impact, youtube.com/Total Nonstop Impact, and all major podcast platforms.
A few housekeeping notes before we jump into the program today. You can connect with us online, tinyurl.com/Grappling with Canada. You can also use YouTube if that's your cup of tea, youtube.com/C/Six-Sided Podcast, or that wonderful YouTube search bar, Grappling with Canada. You can also find us on Twitter at @6_podcast. Now, obviously, the Twitter handle and the YouTube directory, those are holdovers from the previous program, but still, all three ways are tremendous ways to connect with me and this show. Now, of note, on tinyurl.com/Grappling with Canada, you're going to find links to our Amazon store, which, when you use it, does not add 1 single cent to your purchasing order. I just want to make that implicitly clear in case anybody is confused by it. It doesn't add anything to your purchase price, but what it does do is provide a very small kickback to the show to help us keep the lights on. I hate that term, but it comes to mind right now, so I'm going to go with it. Now, also at tinyurl.com/Grappling with Canada, you're going to find a link specifically to Heath McCoy's book. Now, if after listening to him on the program, if you already have the book, by the way, congratulations. You own an incredible read. If after listening to him on the program, I would strongly encourage you, not just for the Amazon link referral, I don't give a shit about that. What I do care about is this book is, like I said, the Bible, the be-all, end-all of Stampede Wrestling, in my opinion, and a really tremendous look at the family dynamic of the Hart family. You'd be hard-pressed to find anything that will ever be better than it. I'm not just saying that because he's on the program. It's honestly such a tremendous read. I cannot put it over enough. Go out after you hear this program and get this book, and please use the Amazon link that's on tinyurl.com/Grappling with Canada. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the program. Now, before I bring my first guest on, the previously mentioned Ashley Rose Nova, I'm going to play a clip from the CBC from 1990. Now, this is a piece done on Stampede Wrestling by Bruce Husley. In it, you're going to hear the voices of the aforementioned Bruce Husley. You're also going to hear Stu Hart, the voice of Stampede Wrestling, Ed Whalen, and Bret Hart. So enjoy this audio, and on the other side, we're going to get to our interview with Ashley Rose Nova.
Control the wrestling in New York.
Stu Hart has been in the fight game for more than 40 years and knows everyone who was anyone.
And this is Jack Dempsey, of course. He was a wonderful person, a great gentleman. And
Hart is the heart and soul of wrestling in Calgary. For 30 years, his syndicated television show, Stampede Wrestling, beamed the exploits of his grapplers all over the globe. But no more. Stu Hart is packing it in to travel with his wife.
if it wasn't for that, I suppose I'd stay in wrestling till I died. But if I'm going to take on any trips, I can't do it after they pull the curtain down on me.
Hart's legacy is the phenomenally successful wrestling show. Seen in more than 50 countries, Stampede Wrestling put Calgary into the forefront of professional wrestling. And the touring production became a prairie happening.
Our Stampede Wrestling speaks for itself over the years. We've filled every building in here for many, many years. And when we go into a big event, we go into the crowd and we'd sell it out.
Stampede Wrestling made Ed Whalen a household name from Alberta to Argentina. His tongue-in-cheek approach changed the way people looked at pro wrestling. He says it's the success of the huge World Wrestling Federation, with its super hype, that has killed some shows like Stampede Wrestling.
There is no question that WWF has become virtually monopolistic, and this giant is trampling a lot of local promotions. A lot of them have bit the dust in the last few years.
Ironically, the World Wrestling Federation owes a lot to Stampede Wrestling. Dozens of its stars developed their toe holds and atomic drops in the Stampede ring. Hart's son Brett is one of them, and he says wrestling in Calgary helped him make the big time.
When you came to Calgary, if you had to learn with the hardest wrestling crowd, because this crowd, then and now, they sit and they watch. They don't cheer unless it's really great wrestling, and they just sit and they watch. And once you get them up, and you can actually get that crowd to cheer, like just to explode, that's when you know that you're good enough to go anywhere.
It was 2 weeks ago when wrestlers stepped into this ring for the last time, and like Bret Hart says, tried to blow the roof off this old pavilion. There's a lot of people out there, a lot of promoters who will try to step into the void, try to be the next Stu Hart. But it's clear that Stampede Wrestling is now part of Calgary history. Bruce Leslie, CBC News, Calgary.
All right, I'm very happy to be joined this evening by the multi-talented, multi-faceted writer, historian, whatever you want to call her. She's very active on Twitter and very active in the wrestling category of everything you could possibly think of. YouTube, on different videos, on different people's podcasts, and joining me on this one tonight, the very fantastic Ashley Rose. Ashley, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's Ashley Rose over here. Yep, I'm in, I guess you could say I have my hands in a bunch of different parts of pro wrestling, or just in a bunch of different pots.
So, I kind of lost track at about 10 or so. You have quite the library of literature that you've written over the years for professional wrestling.
Yeah, recently, I'm going to be honest. I took a small break from writing. Just anything pro wrestling in general. A small break just to basically see, was there anything else I could contribute? When I sat down, I actually realized I've written quite a lot in close to 6 years. So, yeah, I have everything from, I guess, Japanese strong style, Puro, Lucha Libre, tag team wrestling, Canadian wrestling, UK. I guess I'm pretty much everywhere. So
it's funny because going through, and I've been following you on Twitter for, oh God, I don't know, the length of probably the amount of time that I've been on there anyways. And I had always was under the impression that you were from Winnipeg, because a lot of your articles are written on my high school alumni, Kenny Omega, and we'll get into that off air. I don't want to give everything away on the podcast in episode 1, but
really?
yeah, we're gonna get into this. That's an interesting conversation. So we're gonna have that off air. But so I was.
Do you know Mecca too? Do you know?
Well, we'll have a nice conversation in a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's funny. I saw your articles, and a lot of it was Winnipeg centric. So I just, in my mind, I was like, oh, she must be from Winnipeg. So, and not just Winnipeg, but I should say that you've written a lot of articles about Canadian content. Obviously, as well with a lot of your Impact Wrestling articles. There's massive connections between Impact Wrestling and Winnipeg in general. You know, not just with the now addition of Kenny Omega, but Don Callis. You have the Asper family. All the big backers are all from Winnipeg as well. So I had wrongly assumed that you were, so I messaged you about the program, and I said, "Hey, fellow Winnipegger," in the beginning of the message. You're like, "Hey, I'd like to be a part of it, but just one problem: I'm not from Winnipeg."
No, it's okay. I have a lot of friends that are Canadian, and I guess in Winnipeg. I guess you could say I have a strong foundation there. I'm not physically there right now due to the circumstances of the virus and everything going on in the world right now, but I have a strong foundation there.
Well, I'm very happy to be adding to it. I will say that much.
Yeah, I had no idea. What a surprise! Yeah, I was born in South Texas. I've traveled a lot. I've moved a lot. So, yeah, no one exactly knows. When they asked me to come on shows, like when I did the Impact review, they assumed I was in the UK, and I was like, no, I contribute to the UK a lot because, I love pro wrestling in general. It does not matter where in the world. If you enjoy it, if it makes you happy, if it's something that you like, then I'm all for it. And if it's something I'm unaware about or I do not know about, then, I want to interact and I want to know. I want to learn. So I always have an open mind when it comes to pro wrestling as entertainment, as sport. I truly believe it does need to be universally entertaining.
Yeah, you'll get no argument with me on that one. And shout out as well to our good friends at We Talk Impact. That's a tremendous group of people, and they're really, really good friends of mine. So I did catch you on that program. That looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was having some actual connection issues just because where I'm at, the weather kept going in and out, and my power went out, and it messed up my router, so I had that replaced, and I'm pretty solid now, but we got a good amount of time in.
Speaking of good amount of time, we'll dive into the topic du jour, if you will, and that is following the life and career of Stu Hart. So we'll give everybody a quick overview of his early life, and we'll be getting into some interesting tidbits as well. So once again, very happy to have you on the program.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I'm excited. This is yeah. I'm just happy, like I said, I'm just happy to be around and to contribute.
All right, so Stu Hart was born in Saskatoon in 1950. Now, that in itself is kind of funny because everybody just Stu Hart and Calgary. Those are always the two synonymous statements, if you will. But and for our international listeners, because there are many of you out there, Saskatchewan is basically the next door neighbor, if you will, to Alberta, and Saskatoon, and Calgary are separated by 700 kilometers or so. So just it's a long distance apart, but in the context of Canada, and we'll hear that later on in the program, not very far at all. He was born to Edward and Elizabeth Hart. He's mainly of Scot and Irish descent from his father's side, but also had Scottish and English ancestry from his mother. So that might be where some of that Stu Hart, rough and grumble exterior comes from. Having a background like that is certainly grounds for a little bit of volatility, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, coming from that type of background, I think it really shapes a young man into what they, any possibilities of what could happen in the future or, what they can become. I think after some time, if I'm not mistaken, after that is when they eventually moved over to Alberta, correct?
Yeah, so it's kind of a weird situation and I speak a little bit about this later on in the program with another one of our guests. But essentially, they were born as poor as, like, the poorest of poor. They essentially lived in a tent on some property that his father did or didn't have claim to. It kind of depends who you were talking to at the time. And I get into this, like I said, later on with one of my other podcast hosts. But yeah, they were, just imagine, and I'm not sure how cold the winters get where you are, but on the Canadian prairies, a cold winter can easily hit wind chills of minus 35, minus 40, minus 50 degrees Celsius, which is 45 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit minus. So pretty cold to be living in a tent.
Yeah, that's certainly, colder than where I am currently, because I'm further south of America as far as the States. So, I mean, anything pretty much 60 degrees is pretty cold in this area. So, up there, that's incredibly rough. I can't imagine what it must have been like for a young man, or just anyone in general, to essentially, just live, like you said, in pretty much just a tent and on a piece of land where there's no heat. I think that really, as a child, probably shaped his exterior as well as his interior as a person, and being incredibly tough.
So they do end up moving to Edmonton in about 1928, and so obviously we're moving into the dirty 30s, the Great Depression. Now, when they had moved into Edmonton, they were coming into the very start of the Great Depression. But when you're coming from living in a tent, his family was really not affected by the Great Depression as much as a lot of the other economic hits that people were taking at that time. So it's almost funny, right? Not funny, haha, but funny to think, like, okay, we're leaving this place, we're going to go to a better place, we're going to go somewhere where there's more opportunity, better family situation, and boom, the Great Depression hits, right? And you're almost right back to square one. But now this time, a little bit more set up for a life of success, if you will. Not living in a tent, I will say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As far as the Great Depression, I mean, it must have been, some type of, I wouldn't say an upgrade, but it must have been maybe a little bit of a relief to them just to have more than what they eventually had, even though during that time economically, it was a great, there was such a struggle at that time period. It must have provided them maybe with some type of relief, regardless of, the time period and the circumstances.
I know that they meaning Stu and his siblings, had spent some time in and out of Salvation Army housings. I know Stu's father was arrested around that time for, I believe it was back taxes, as it related to the land dispute that he had back in Saskatoon. And then unfortunately his mother had passed away. So you're talking about, like, okay, you grew up in a tent, right? Yeah, you moved to Edmonton, this city of, financial betterment or whatever. That goes to shit. Now your father's in jail. Now your mother passes away. Just how much unfortunate incidents can you pack into one young man's life? And this is, before 1930. It's incredible.
Yeah, this is around, before 1930, like 1928, somewhere around there. I'm, going back and, rereading, a lot of stuff, as far as Stu's, past or previous history. It's, it really does surprise me and amaze me. And it's almost, this is a type of story, I mean, you would think it was literally written for a movie,
Yes.
It's just so dramatic and unfortunate, to be that young and to have basically all this unfortunate events occur. You wouldn't think it was real. It's almost like I said, it's almost pretty much written like if it's a movie or a film, but no, this actually happened.
It's funny I want to circle back to your comment, it's almost like a film, because there's some interesting things that happen in his life which do happen in a film, and we're gonna touch on that a little bit later. In terms of, Stu having a real rough childhood, doesn't give up. He ends up actually starting to attend, and this is the earliest that I can find that he started learning wrestling. So he was attending amateur wrestling classes in the YMCA in Edmonton in 1921, and from then started learning the art form of wrestling. And it was said that he was like a fish to water. He got everything. By the age of 15, he won the Edmonton City Championship in the middleweight class and the Alberta Provincial Championship later that same year. He continued to train and improve in his abilities, and by 1937, he was a Dominion welterweight champion. So just because, again, our international listeners may not know, Canada wasn't actually a country back in 1937. Canada actually didn't become a country till, completely diverse of the British Crown till 1985, I believe. So we're talking about 1937. Yes, he's in Canada, the Dominion of Canada, not the country of Canada. Very important thing to keep in mind as we move forward here. So in 1938, he did actually qualify for the British Empire Games in Australia, but he wasn't able to go because he didn't have any money. Obviously, the economic dissuasions, if you will, that we had talked about earlier, they just keep piling on. He finally has a chance to go somewhere, and he can't because of the economic depression, and especially, too, there was a severe lack of funding from the Canadian government because at that time they were kind of gearing up for World War II, and we're going to get into that in a little bit as well. His amateur career did peak in 1940 when he won the Dominion Amateur Wrestling Championship in the light heavyweight category, and he also would have competed at the Summer Olympics in Helsinki in 1940, but that big thing that I just talked about, World War II, that kind of kiboshed the Olympics in that region. So horrible for him, right? Again, just it's funny you talk about, like, we've kind of hammered on how many things can go wrong for one guy in a very short amount of time. We're talking 25 years. It's incredible. Like, he has a chance to make a better life for himself, can't do that. Then he has a chance to make a name for himself in wrestling, can't do that. Then he has a chance to go to the Olympics, and he can't do that. Yeah. He's goddamn snake bit.
Yeah, it's just, it's blow after blow after blow, unfortunately for Stu at this time period. But yeah, he was always like a phenomenal grappler. I mean, that's pretty much what he's known for, and it just always came natural for him. But yeah, it's always, and it's just unfortunate that he had all these opportunities, but due to what was going on in the economy, then there's a war, World War II. How much more can a young man take as far as either I can imagine it might have been a great disappointment to him. I mean, it's like no matter, it's almost like he takes one step forward, it's like 3 steps back.
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, it's not just like 3 baby steps either. It's like 3 gigantic, it's incredible. And what strength of character to persevere as well through it all. It's really a testament to Stu Hart's character, I would say.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to read this little excerpt because it's really also going to go into another guest that I have later on in this program, and the dangers of driving in Canada in winter on our now infamous highways. So On Christmas Eve 1941, Hart was almost killed in a bicycle accident which broke both his elbows and thumbs and hurt his back. The injuries risked ending his athletic career. It happened while he was on the way to visit his father to celebrate Christmas with the family, when a fire truck drove behind him and forced him to swerve to the side of the road, where he was hit by another car, propelling him 30 feet forward onto the road and scraping off a large portion of his skin on the process. So, this just is a fucking laundry list that just keeps adding up unfortunate incidents for Stu Hart.
During the holidays.
During the holidays, yeah, he's going, and we're coming up on Christmas now, and it's just like, oh my god, right? Again, this could be in a movie and you wouldn't believe it, but this is real life, so, it's insane. So he spent several months in the Royal Alexandria Hospital in Edmonton recovering. In the springtime, when he was still in the hospital, he was visited by Al Oming. And now that's a very important name that we're going to get to later on, both with you and with one of my guests later on in the program. He was a young neighbor who was drafted into the Royal Canadian Navy for World War II. And that was really what stuck with Stu and made him want to enlist into the Navy for World War II.
Yeah, I mean, he went to the Navy for World War II. I mean, it wasn't until... Wait, hold on. During that time, wasn't he also wrestling as well?
He was wrestling, so...
At the same time?
Yeah, so this is where it gets funny, and this is where I wanted to bring up your point about the movie aspect of it. So, I'm sure you've seen all the Marvel movies, right?
Just about, except for, like, the last Avengers.
Okay, so you've seen the first Captain America movie, right? Where he... Yeah, so he gets enhanced, if you will, but he's like a figurehead for the army, right? They don't let him fight. He's just like a rah-rah guy, and he's doing all these rallies for the troops and whatever. Well, that was legitimately the real-life situation that Stu Hart was in. They put him in the Navy, or he was enlisted in the Navy. They saw his athletic background. They named him director of athletics. Then in 43, he was put in for a transfer out east in Canada to Nova Scotia. Now that's where essentially every Navy serviceman would leave to go fight in the Atlantic. Everybody left through Nova Scotia. So they being the Navy, had him wrestling for the troops, just like you saw Captain America entertaining the troops that were leaving overseas or were currently overseas, fighting the Germans. There was Stu Hart. That was his actual life role in World War II. Is incredible.
So what you're saying is basically Stu Hart's like Captain America.
Yeah, he's like... Goddamn, just call him Captain Canada. Like for no, it's just I'm reading his backstory and I'm like, it's one of those things where you're like, I've seen this before. Yeah, like did I not see this? And you put two and two together, it's just mind-boggling.
Still one of my favorite Marvel films, first Captain America.
It's a tremendous movie. Obviously based on Stu Hart.
Basically, Captain America was based off of Stu Hart.
Yeah. So during his stay, I know that's not the correct term, but his tour of duty in World War II, he was organizing money, relief efforts for the war effort. He was doing all these things, but he kept trying to get out of the Navy, kept trying to get out, but every time they try to get out, they pull him back in. So he actually never got his release out of the Navy until 1946. Now, obviously, World War II ended in 1944, so 2 years after, he's still in the Navy. They finally give him his release, and then he's able to kick off his professional wrestling career. Mm-hmm. And that was the time... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. You're probably going to say what I'm going to say.
So... Obviously, he leaves the Navy. This is the time where, again, he runs into Al Oming, his friend from the hospital, or his neighbor, I should say, who got him enlisted in the Navy. He has the idea, hey, let's jump down to the States and let's try out this wrestling thing. So he ends up going to the New York Territory.
like I said, you were just getting to what I was about to say. And first, should I tell your listeners as far as who Al is?
Yes, please.
Okay. Al is also the co-founder of Stampede Wrestling, so there's a little note there. So that's why Al is essentially important as far as the story goes. Or, facts. Not necessarily a story, but facts.
If we're keeping in line with the Captain America theory, Al would be his Bucky.
There you go. And the more you read about the story, the actual truth of that, it is.
Yeah, the deeper you go, the more similarities you come across, which is incredible. So, obviously, in the New York territory, he received training from Tutsmont and debuted in New York City. Now, if you're going to debut in wrestling in any city in North America, New York's that's a pretty good place to cut your teeth.
Yeah, that was pretty much the most known place to go at the time, at least during, the 1940s, would be New York. If you had a debut there, you were going places. You were either considered a star or an attraction for people, or you were considered extremely talented as far as being a pro wrestler. There's a lot of, I can't really think of it off the top of my head, but there are a lot of people during that time that did debut in New York, or at least had a lot of influence in that area.
Oh, it's the amount of talent that either, and this is back in the territory system days. Like, this is would it have been Continental at that time? I'm trying to think. It wouldn't have been the WWF yet in 1947, I don't believe. But it might have been Continental. But anyways, so this is back in the territory system. This is the era where you have, like, the NWA they have their territories. You have the Dallas offices are operating. You have Knoxville is running. You have the Fullers running. It's just completely different than how everything is nowadays. Yeah. But yes, again, New York was the hub, right? So he's wrestling the who's who of wrestling at the time. He's wrestling Lou Thez. He's wrestling Frank Sexton. He's wrestling Sander Kovacs. He's wrestling Laura James Blears. Actually, he had a tag team with him as well. It's crazy. Like, this kid who comes from nothing in a no-name town in Saskatchewan is now all of a sudden like a big a big-time draw in the biggest wrestling market in North America.
Yeah, and also, apparently, according to our history records, and if you, saw any old photos of Stu, he was described as tall, dark, and handsome, and they could basically make a bill out of that, during the time.
Yeah, nothing says babyface like tall, dark, and handsome, right? If you're gonna win ladies over, that's probably how you're doing it. Yeah, I don't think Stu wrestling in a mask was ever part of the equation. No. And actually, he was ribbed quite a bit in New York for being the pretty boy. Sorry, listen to me talk. But that ended pretty quickly when he started shooting on some people. And there's stories that I've read of other wrestlers in that territory. Lou Thez being one of them, talking about that. Yeah, you may not want to be fucking with Stu Hart. He's the tough guy. Oh yeah, let's try him. Yeah, well, it didn't work out very well for them because Stu's reputation for stretching people in the dungeon, well, a lot of that came from his time in the New York territory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, come on, it's I wouldn't have taken Stu lightly, or especially if they knew his background or knew anything about him. Stu was a nice man, but you didn't want to cross him. That was just one man you did not want to cross. And
obviously at this time in New York, that's when he meets his wife, Helen. They only were dating for a year and a half, I believe, is from what I can tell from records. But, yeah, they got married. Obviously, they go on to have 12 kids. Like, I got 2 kids. my God, couldn't imagine having 12 kids.
My stepmother's actually 1 out of 12.
Really?
Yeah, my stepmother. Yeah, she's 1 out of 12. And her dad, one of my grandfathers used to just say it was just because things were cheaper by the dozen at the time.
Well, I guess you get a lot of life out of clothes, that's for sure.
And the crazy thing is they only had like a 3 or 4 bedroom house.
What, do they sleep on each other?
To this day I still question it. I honestly do. I never, my stepmother, she explained how it worked to me, because a couple of my aunts were older and they moved out, or one of my uncles was older and he moved out, but still that still leaves 6 of them, so I'm still not exactly sure how that worked. And my mother's 1 out of 6 children.
Jeez, I can only imagine.
Yeah, I can't imagine either. I'm still a little baffled by it all, and still trying to. There's just things you just don't question after a certain point.
Yeah, there gets to a point where you just kind of accept it and move forward, if you will.
Yeah, and as for me, I only have 1 other sibling, and the other ones are by marriage. As far as when my mother got remarried, I have a stepbrother. Well, I actually have 2, but I'm not close to any of them. So, I'm not my central family unit that I'm from. There's not a lot of us. It's just me and 1 other sibling. So. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine 6 or 12, and then even during that time, I don't know if maybe economically it was achievevable, but still, to me, that just seems like a lot of stress. Nothing against large families, but I still, it boggles my mind, how that can even work in a small home, or economically. I just can't imagine, and especially, 12 hearts, that's a lot.
Yeah, to those who can, all the power to you. I am not one of those, though.
Absolutely.
That's for sure.
Absolutely. All the power to you.
So while, and we're keeping with his time in the New York territory, and we're kind of winding it down as well. This is where he really started focusing on that submission style and technical style of wrestling. So, which is funny, because back then that's not what got the attention of the writers. What got the attention of the Dave Meltzers of that time was a lot of the, it's the flashy performers. It was the not much of the top rope stuff, but a lot of the innovative wrestling, rather than the British or the Canadian style of that real mat wrestling, the real technical style. Personally, that's my favorite style of wrestling. But it's funny to me that he's so popular with the fans and the women especially. And he's a big draw, and he's working with all these big names, but he doesn't get the recognition from the printed media. And to me, it would almost seem like that would be the opposite nowadays, right? A guy who is technically proficient and somebody who is a star and connects with the fans, that would almost be, oh goddamn, that would be the guy you would see as number 1 on the PWI every year, right?
It varies. There's a lot of performers that I can say have a lot of charisma, but only do technical style wrestling. For me, the way I range performances, I pay attention to the moveset. I pay attention if you have any type of chemistry with your opponent, or if you have the ability to work with anyone. I also pay attention to how well you are over with your fans, or just how easy it is for you to win over any audience in any country. That's how I view things. As far as other writers, some people base it off of just charisma, and they would vote whoever, for the top, 100 or top 50, depending on what it is. So I tend to view everything, but a lot of it has to do with, I guess, how over you can get.
So, and I want to, because you're the perfect person to ask this, when you're writing an article on somebody, regardless if it's Stu or whoever it is, do you take things into, or would you take things into account, like, okay, they came from blank, now they're here, they've been established for X amount of years, they've done this. Does that enter into your equation, or is it easier, or maybe an easier read for the readers if everything is very now centric? If it's like, okay, this is what this person's doing today, and like this was their match, 2 weeks ago. Like, what's an easier article to write versus what article do you prefer to write?
The easiest article to write is definitely results to a match. That's my opinion, because it takes less time and effort. But as far as the way I like to write things, if I automatically assume every time I write a new article, regardless if I have, devoted readers, which I do, it doesn't matter what platform I'm at, they will read it. You have your devoted fans of, whoever it is I'm writing about, that will read it. That's a given. But I always take in consideration that there is someone that knows absolutely nothing about that performer or that match or the background history of what's leading up to it. So that is kind of how I go into an article like that. I always give some type of background history that is essential to what is going on to that current moment. Like I said, I always go through the assumption that there is someone, at least one person, that wants to know more about that performer or wants to know something extra, not just what's happening today or what's happening tomorrow or last week or this month.
I suppose I'm almost having a hard time to wrap my head around, okay, this guy's a star, he's putting on tremendous matches with top-tier talent, but we're not going to write about him. And oh, by the way, he's a big-time fan favorite, but let's not write about him. I don't know, it just seems like such a missed opportunity, but maybe that just is piling on. Maybe that's just... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please interrupt me any time at all. Please just go right ahead.
No, it is. It absolutely is. And I also think maybe at the time it also had to do with maybe, how many people actually wanted to write about pro wrestling at the time as well. Or, they just, write about the main event or the results. That could also be it as well. I would really have to look into that time period and see what type of articles were printed as far as, in the paper or any type of newsletter at the time.
I suppose that's true, too, because I'm trying to think when the boom period would have started for the New York territory. I want to say it was like the early 50s, so maybe he was a couple of years too early for that kind of recognition, if you will.
Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, like I said, it could just be how many people were actually writing long-form articles, or they could have just been writing results and documenting, Hart faced so-and-so, or Hart and so-and-so faced, X amount of people, or this is what happened, or this is what equaled the final pinfall, or the submission, or anything like that. I mean, we still have that today going on, where it's not really a detailed article, but it's more or less just very okay, so-and-so pins, so-and-so for a 3 count.
Very superficial.
So very quick and to the point, So it's a possibility that could have happened at the time. I could be wrong. I never stated I could be right about that, but that's just my assumption, and I'm just going to leave it as that, because, that's the only thing I could really think of.
Well, obviously, we're putting you to the post here. Your word is 100%, 100% what happened there.
Oh, really? Well,
Yeah.
then,
Must be
okay.
must be now.
Oh.
So I suppose as we kind of wind down this segment of the program, I'd like to just ask a couple of questions. First, because you're obviously from America and you kind of been all over the map, like you said, moving from Texas to where you are now. What do you view the legacy of Stu Hart from an American wrestling fan's point of view?
Well, I feel that as far as what Stu has brought to pro wrestling, it is important. It is historical. It is beyond legendary. But most of all, to any student out there of the art form of, pro wrestling or any fan, to me, the importance of, Stu or the Harts or just any of their legacy is the fundamentals that they provided all of us when it comes to technical wrestling.
Yes.
So, fundamentals.
I find it interesting. I've asked a few of the guests that you're going to hear later on in the program, what their thoughts were, and I have a promoter on the program, and he talks about, the promotion kind of aspects that Stu Hart brought to the table and that people can take from today. I have a journalist on the program later, and he spent a lot of time with the Hart family, so I asked him the same question, and he talks about Stu Hart, the man himself, like what he meant to him. And then it's interesting to hear from you, like the writer who writes articles, and you write tremendous articles about different wrestlers and where they come from, how they get into whatever, and that the fact that you would focus on like the technicals and the fundamentals and just the bell to bell, if you will, that's what you would bring up. Is just, to me, it's so interesting that so many people can take so many different facets from Stu Hart, but still in their frame of reference, if you will. To me, it's just super interesting.
Yeah, to me, fundamentals have always been important. As far as, like I said, I've written about so many different types of wrestling, and, I kind of sit in awe, almost of, like, how many years it's been. And I haven't been around really as long as, like, Fightful or Dave Meltzer or anything like that. But the most important thing to me is fundamentals. It's always been fundamentals. Your ability in the ring, your ability to connect with your audience. The story you can tell is always important to me. Any type of in-ring psychology. Those are... And how much it actually means to you. If I can believe that you have a lot of heart and passion in your style of wrestling, then you've won me over.
Yes.
And I think that's what a lot of people, I wish, could focus on maybe a little bit more. But, other things are important too, as far as, like, Stu Hart, the promoter, what type of training he provided to wrestling, pupils or his family. And a lot of those people, the majority of them, ended up very successful with his training as far as what he could provide. But to me, when I think of Stu Hart, I think of fundamentals and technical wrestling.
Very well said, I must say. Very well said. Before we let you go for the evening, where can everybody find yourself and where your articles can be found?
Okay, well, I am on TWM News. That's, in the UK, twm.news. You can find me on social media. Instagram, Twitter, it doesn't matter. I pretty much talk to whoever. And that's A Rose CPE. That's Charlie Papa Echo. And in there, if you go to my bio, you can click my link tree, and there is a link to almost every single platform I've ever written for and contributed to. So, pretty simple.
And you have a Pro Wrestling Tees store as well, right?
Yep, it's in there as well.
Perfect. So everybody, I will ask you to take that time, and I'm going to be linking all this to the individual set of tweets, and you'll be on the website as well as we kind of launch everything. So everybody can go give Ashley a follow and go see what she's been cooking up, because I've read a lot of your stuff. It's really, really well done, and everybody would be very hard pressed to find somebody who's a more passionate and more knowledgeable about the content that they write for than you.
Oh, well, thank you. You know, I try my best. You know, I don't certainly think I'm the best writer in the world.
No, put yourself over. It's wrestling.
Yeah, you know, I should, but I don't. I'm pretty humble. You know, I'm pretty thankful and grateful, and you know, I'm, you know, like I said, you know, I had taken, you know, a few months off to really think if I was going to, you know, continue writing. But if anything, I'm very grateful for everything I have contributed, you know, especially to Canadian wrestling, because a lot of people don't know this, but I learned this, that a lot of fundamentals from Canadian wrestling actually extends out into the world of pro wrestling. You would be surprised, like, you know, like Australia and the UK, you know, and certainly America, you know, from what we're talking about.
And that's why I wanted to get your point of view as well, right? Like, being an American journalist, you're going to have a very different viewpoint than I would sitting in Winnipeg, or than any of my other guests would in various parts of the country. So, I always want to frame all of our conversations on this program, not just to the Canadian audience, but to the international audience, because wrestling is not just one country, it's not just one region, it's not just one territory. This is the tendrils of not just Stu Hart, but Canadian wrestling in general go all over the world and influence so many different people and styles and cultures and everything. It's really it's an incredible feat.
Yeah, like I said, you know, people would be surprised, you know, how much, like, of an influence Canadian wrestling actually has around the world. I'm not saying everyone's influenced by it, but I'm just saying, like, there's always some type of footstep that always ends up leading back to something back in Canada, you know, whether it be Calgary, whether it be Winnipeg, you know, it's you know, there's always some type of, like, foot back into Canada. And like I said, you know, like, I love pro wrestling. I love Canadian wrestling. I love Lucha Libre. I love Puro, Strong Style, you know, Brit Rest, you know, like, technical wrestling, you know. To me, it's always wrestling, and if it's awesome, and I can enjoy it, it really doesn't matter to me what you could describe the style or what the style primarily is. If I enjoy it and you enjoy it, then, you know, that's all that should matter.
If you're hooked, you're hooked, right?
You're hooked. Yeah, exactly. If you enjoy it, that's all that matters.
Exactly. Now, before I bring in our next guest, I'm going to play a clip from Stampede Wrestling. Now, in this clip, you're going to hear the trials and tribulations and the dangers of being a promoter in Canadian wrestling, which will tie us directly into our next guest. But in this clip, you're going to hear Stu Hart. You're going to hear, again, the voice of Stampede Wrestling in the ring, Mr. Ed Whalen. You're going to hear that he's a goddamn heel, in the words of Jim Cornette. Archie the Stomper Goldie. You won't hear him, but in the video, you're going to hear Stu Hart be assaulted, if you will, by the likes of J.R. Foley. And then you're going to hear the save by our hero of the time, Bret Hart. So we're going to get into this classic audio from Stampede Wrestling. And on the other side, I'm very happy to be joined by Canadian wrestling's elite, Mr. Danny Duggan.
Well, Stu Hart, there's been all sorts of action here, and I can remember the days when you used to call Archie Goldie the Stomper in here to kind of clean house, and now I know after an altercation in Vancouver, and some of the things he's saying, he's after you.
Yeah, well, I remember one time we're having a lot of trouble with Abdullah, and it looked like he was running herd around here, so I was provoked and prevailed by some of his friends, Goldie's friends, to call the Stomper in to clean house. So sure enough, I brought the Stomper in, and he did run Abdullah out. I've got to give Goldie credit. He's a tough son of a gun. He's one of the toughest wrestlers that I know in the business, and I have a lot of respect for him. I started that son of a gun out when he was a big, raw-boned, 240-pound kid. He was playing football for the North Hill Blizzard or something like that then. Playing junior football.
I remember that. Well, speak of the devil.
I believe everybody has equal time here in the TV, and I don't believe anybody wants to stand out, sit at home, and listen to you for an hour. I have my interview now. My interview is now, and your time is up.
Give me the courtesy. Wait until I finish my interview.
Your time is up. I got my stopwatch right here.
Oh, yeah?
Well, just a minute. Stu knocks him down with a beautiful elbow. Takes a look at Foley and knocks him down as well. Champ did a right corner. Gives him that uppercut at close range. I can't get out of here. J.R. Foley grabbing him from behind, pulls him down. Now it's 2 against 1. The crowd yelling for Bret Hart. What's going on here? Where are the Hart kids? Look out! There's Bruce Hart. Knocks the Stomper down. Foley runs for cover. Clambering away at the Stomper. Look at him go. Crowd loves every minute of it, and the Stomper gets out of there. Well, Stu had 2 of them after him. That's ridiculous.
Hey, Whalen, he takes the cake for me. I've seen it all. There he is, Archie Stomper. It's okay for you to jump me. When you jump my father, it's a different thing.
Let me tell you something, punk. Don't you ever jump me from behind again. I got a contract here, and the only name on it is mine, because you don't have enough guts to put your name on this contract. I'm going to see how much guts you got. There you go, man. Punk, put your name on it if you got any guts.
Well, out goes the Stomper.
Who's running now? Every time I get in the ring with a Stomper, I come in and he runs away. This is the first time I've seen a contract. And if you got a pen, I'll sign it right now. And next week, me and Archie Goldie will settle it. So once and for all, because I watched Archie Stomper for years. He come back now. He's the big man. He's a tough guy. But I was here for 5 years. I earned a reputation that everyone in this building and all people that have watched wrestling for 5 years know that I had a good, solid reputation. And I'm a Western Canadian boy. He's a Western Canadian boy. If he wants to settle something, we'll get in the ring. And I promise, I'll beat that old man.
Okay, Bret Hart with a contract to meet the Stomper.
Earlier in the program, we discussed the Stampede territory itself, but what did and does promoting a territory like Stampede actually entail? To answer that, I'm very happy to welcome to the program the man who wears many hats for Canadian wrestling's elite, but most important to the context of this program, he is the promoter of CWE, Mr. Hotshot, Danny Duggan himself. Danny, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So for anybody who is not aware, CWE although it doesn't run exactly the same territory, it runs, as far as I can tell, about the closest thing to the same territory as Stampede Wrestling used to run back in the day.
Yeah, I would say we pretty much identical to the territory they ran in terms of what we cover on our national tours, but we've actually expanded past that. Prior to the COVID restrictions and the lockdown across the country, we were operating Vancouver through Ottawa with our debut event supposed to be taking place in Quebec this past March. So we pretty much had the entire country minus the Maritimes covered prior to the lockdown. So we cover a lot of ground with the tours, and I'm sure we'll get into those specifics. But with Stu's territory, he was specifically in Alberta. He would do some eastern British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and once in a blue moon, make it out to Manitoba. But that's all part of our regular loop, as Alberta's now become one of our more prominent touring markets, and Manitoba is our home, so we're here quite a bit as well.
So it's interesting you brought that up. I want to read you a quote from Bret Hart's book, or I want to ask you if this sounds at all any way familiar. So they make a 3-hour drive to Edmonton on Saturday, driving back after the show in the middle of the night. We'd be home in Calgary for Sunday, where we'd have our bookings, general business meetings at the Hart House. On Monday, we'd drive 400 miles to Saskatoon, staying in a sleazy hotel Monday night. And then on Tuesday, we'd drive 180 miles from Saskatoon to Regina. Sometimes we'd stay over, but we'd often drive the 500 miles back to Calgary after the show, arriving with the sunrise Wednesday morning. Wednesday was 150 miles north to Red Deer, then back after the show. Thursday is 225 miles south to Lethbridge and back. This went on every week of the year. Does that at all sound a little bit familiar from your experiences running, obviously, out west in Canada?
Yeah, that pretty much sums up life of a Canadian professional wrestler. With the tours themselves, like we do 30, we're doing 30 to 36 days in a row, so we wouldn't have a day off, and we're just going town to town, one after the other, just kind of doing one giant loop. But even outside of CWE, or even when we're doing single shots or 3 or 4 day tours, or smaller scale stuff, that's pretty much Canadian wrestling in a nutshell. Like being here in Winnipeg, I've been wrestling now, will be 18 years next month. And, the closest out-of-province city that had regular wrestling when I was breaking in was Regina, which was a 6-hour drive. And that's, on the low end of things. It was quite common. We were doing, drives to Calgary and Edmonton 2-3 times a month. And that's a 13-hour overnight drive. You get to Calgary the day of the show. You would wrestle that night. And you'd either, try to get some sleep and be on the road first thing in the morning to head up to Edmonton, or you would continue driving another 3 hours overnight so you can get to Edmonton and try to sleep as much as you can prior to the event in Edmonton that night. And either you're getting up and going to another show the next day, or you're getting in the car and driving back 13 hours home that same night. So it's very common when you're traveling to Canadian independence to be doing those long drives. And that's part of why, and I'm sure we'll get into it, why, the CWE tours are structured and laid out the way they are, is all the major markets in Canada are so far and they're so spread out that you have no choice but to get in the car and do the drives. Rain or shine, snow or summer, you're doing them, because in the U.S., you take any major U.S. market and you pin it on the map and you do a 5-hour radius, you're going to find 10 other major cities with 1 million people in them or close to it that you can run and operate your business in. You don't have that in Canada. You have your major cities in each province and a whole lot of dead space in between that you got to either make up driving or you got to stop in and do the small towns in between. So
it's interesting that you said that. Earlier in the program, we were discussing, the differences between travel times in America, for example, and travel times in Canada. And I'm not talking about specifically the time between places, but the drive itself. Like we're talking highways that are sometimes not really highways that are maybe you're doing, 80, 70 kilometers an hour. That's all you can do on them, because they're winding through prairie land, or they're winding through the Rockies, or they're winding through a lot of heavily forested areas. There are a lot of times in Canada when you're driving from small town to small town, you'll drive, 50, 60, 70 kilometers, not see one single soul on the road. You'll be driving, 100 kilometers, and I'm talking not a soul as in not a car on the road, but no farmland, no developed anything. It's you, no street lights, you in the road, and whatever wildlife you may encounter. Just to put that into context, you're talking about the tour that you ran. I found one of your old tours, not that old. Listen to me talk. We're in the pandemic era. Nobody's been able to run anything for the goddamn past year. But this is from your Pick Your Poison tour that you had Jake Roberts on, I believe, correct?
Yes, that was a 21-day tour at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018.
So I'm going to run down this list here just to because we can talk and we can say, oh, you know, it's a long drive between towns, but it's kind of hard to quantify that. So I've gone through this tour schedule and I've actually mapped out the kilometers you traveled on this. So we'll see if even if this blows your mind. But so starting from Winnipeg to Stonewall, that was your first stop on the tour. That's 56 kilometers. From there, you're going to Gladstone. That's 123 kilometers. Now you're going to Yorktown. Now we're crossing the border from Manitoba to Saskatchewan. For all those international listeners out there, that's another 304 kilometers. From Yorktown to Melfort is 280 kilometers. Then to Prince Albert is another 95 kilometers. To Saskatoon is 138 kilometers. And now we cross the border again. We're going from Saskatchewan to Alberta. For a quick jaunt, it's only 534 kilometers to your next show in St. Albert, Alberta. Not to be outdone there, we're going to cross borders again. We're going into BC, which you had talked about earlier. We're going to Golden, BC. A short trip, only 572 kilometers away from your previous night. We take a trip back into Alberta from BC into Calgary. That's another 263 kilometers. Down to Medicine Hat for 292 kilometers. Crossing the border again backwards to Saskatchewan. We're hitting Assiniboia. That's 388 kilometers. We go to Regina for 175. 224 kilometers only to Moosomin, so there's a big win of it all. Then we cross the border into friendly Manitoba, where you hit Virden. That's 66 kilometers away from Moosomin. From there, you're going to Souris, which is 71 kilometers away from then. Brandon, the shortest trip on this entire thing, including Winnipeg to Stonewall, Souris to Brandon, only 48 kilometers. Incredible, I'm sure, at this point in time.
To think we'd be sleeping in that day and catching up on some rest.
Yeah, no kidding.
We're usually up till 6 a.m. and dragging ourselves out of bed at 11 in the morning to get to the gym the next day.
Oh, exactly. And and not like you're going to take it easy either after that, because now you're off to Morden for a 210-kilometer drive. Now you're back into Winnipeg, and I want to touch on that show after this is all said and done, but that's a 126-kilometer drive. Now we're going to cross borders again. We're going east out into Ontario to Thunder Bay. A nice little 702-kilometer drive. And then we're going to do our last stop that I have recorded on this tour to Sault Ste. Marie. Another 700-kilometer drive. So from what I have written down here, you hit 20 cities in 20 days. You guys drove 5,364 kilometers total on this trip.
Well, if you think that's wild, by the end of that year, not even 12 months later, we had added an additional 14 to 16 shows on the tour. And we started going up to northern Alberta. So usually by the time we were done Edmonton, we were going up to Grand Prairie, which is about 5-6 hour drive from Edmonton. And then we were cutting over to Prince George, BC in northern British Columbia, which was another 6-hour drive. We hit a couple markets in that area that were around 2 to 3 hours apart. And then we'd do a 5-hour drive to the west coast of Vancouver. And we hit up Vancouver. And then when we were done there, we would start heading back east with a stop in the Okanagan, either in the Kamloops, Penticton, or Vernon. And then from there, we do that loop you just mentioned. We hit all those towns all the way through to Winnipeg, hit Thunder Bay, hit Sault Ste. Marie, and then when we were done that 7-hour drive to Sault Ste. Marie, we'd go another 6 hours to Sudbury, another 5 hours to Toronto, and another 4 to Ottawa. And by the time it was all done, we had a nice 32-hour drive home to get back to Winnipeg when the tour was all wrapped up. So I think we ended up capping out something like 11,000 kilometers by the time it was all said and done on that last tour.
And I can't stress that enough to any international listeners that are listening. A lot of this is done in the wintertime too, or in less than favorable months of driving. When you're driving on a lot of these highways, there's some sketchy highways, especially in that, you know, northern Manitoba. I know for sure because I've driven it myself. But when you're going out west, there's stretches of highway where you're weaving and winding through heavily forested areas, and there are sections where, you know, the posted speed limit says 70, and you can't even drive that, especially in you know, blizzardy conditions, or if it's raining or whatever. It's incredible the amount of miles, hard miles, that you have to put on just to make towns like that in Canada.
Yeah, luckily Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta for the most part, the roads are pretty good with it being in the prairies. So other than getting stuck on a one-lane highway when it's raining or snowing, it's not too bad. When you get stuck behind those trucks on a one-lane highway and you can't see to pass, that's when it gets a little bit scary. The most dangerous parts of those trips would definitely be British Columbia, northern British Columbia. When you start getting up there, you're going through the mountains, you're going through the forest. So there's some pretty scary drives going from northern British Columbia down to Vancouver, where you're encountering all kinds of wildlife, all kinds of wavy roads and very short highway. And then I would say the most dangerous in Canada would definitely be, at least on our tour, would be northwestern Ontario. Once you start getting past Thunder Bay and you start going towards Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, and then further east, that's when it gets really scary. It's a one-lane highway the entire way, and then when you start deviating off to the small northern communities in Ontario, the highways are really sketchy. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with, it was May of last year, I was in a really bad car accident where actually, was very close to losing my life on one of those tours from the vehicle hitting a ditch in some really bad, wet, raining conditions while we were on our way to one of the towns, where I ended up, drowning and having to be pulled out and saved. That was 2 or 3 days before the end of that trip, and that was it for me. So the realities are very, very real. You can get on those roads, and it can be a perfectly fine day, or you can get a day like we had that day, where it's raining, it's a little bit of snow, and you're just as good as your driver is that day. And unfortunately, on that day specifically, we hit a ditch, and luckily no one was seriously hurt, and we all recovered. But it could have very well went the other way, and that's something I'm very surprised doesn't happen more often, especially being on the road for almost 2 decades and knowing the amount of times guys have traveled and how frequently they were traveling pre-COVID. To know that so many guys have gotten out unscathed on these highways, because the risk is very real.
That was the tour with Psychosis, I believe, correct?
Yes, sir. He was my Superman. He was the one that pulled me out of the car from drowning.
That's right. I remember I had seen the pictures of that on Twitter, and it's one of those things where you look at it and you don't process it right away, right? And then you look at it again, you're like, what the hell am I looking at? And then you get the story, and it's like, Jesus Christ. And to your point, it is surprising that, it doesn't happen a lot more because of, distances traveled and various road hazards that you may or may not encounter on the travels itself. It's incredible.
And it's scary to think, I remember, vividly when it was happening, not being concerned as the car started to spin out, because I couldn't tell you the amount of times we've hit a ditch in the last 18 years on the highway. Like, it's common practice that it's going to happen a couple times throughout the winter, especially traveling on all the different highways that we've mentioned. It becomes a part of the lifestyle. You're going to have some slippery roads. You're going to end up in a ditch. There's going to be too much snow, but it happens, in a way where you weren't put in serious risk, but it happens enough where you kind of get used to it, and you start to kind of take it for granted and go, that's going to be fine. No big deal. And I recall that very much being the case as we were slipping. It was like, we're hitting a ditch. We've done this a dozen times before, not thinking anything of it, until the car was upside down and filling up with water. And that's when the panic started to come in. But I recall, as that vehicle was slipping, going, just another day at the office. We're going to have to get pulled out, and on our way to the show, we'll be a little bit late, but it'll be fine. And, unfortunately, there's a curveball in that plan that day, but, more times than not, that's kind of what happens. That's just the reality of being on those roads and driving in those conditions, and you just learn to kind of be numb to it. Obviously,
the travel itself is a big hindrance when you're booking in Canada. We talked briefly about the weather as well. A lot of people, they hear Canada, the Great White North, they're automatically, you guys live in a tundra and there's igloos and all this kind of shit. Obviously, when Stu Hart was running Stampede Wrestling, I was reading a lot of correspondences that he had with the NWA, where he's constantly asking for help to get wrestlers over the border, help with trans, help with getting their papers done. Just talk a little bit about what it's like as a Canadian promoter to not only run the towns that you're running, but to bring in international talent into Canada, kind of some of the roadblocks and some of the issues that you constantly find yourself running into.
Luckily, for the most part, it's not as challenging as it may have been back then, in the sense that it's been happening now for so long that there's systems in place to do it pretty much hindrance free. It's perfectly legal and fine for professional wrestlers to come and ply their trade in Canada as an entertainer. So as long as they've got a clean record and they're honest at the border, they can cross into the country and wrestle anytime without any visa or any paperwork that would say otherwise. So in that regard, it's very easy. Unfortunately, you know, for us Canadian wrestlers, we don't have that same benefit. The U.S. law isn't the same as the Canadian law, and you do need to have specific qualifications to be able to enter the U.S. to wrestle. Talent coming from America or Europe or Japan coming to Canada, they don't have that roadblock. So as long as they got the proper information and their itinerary on why they're coming, it's relatively easy. But with that being said, we have had guys that have been turned away at the border because they weren't honest with me or honest with customs officials on some of their past history. And once you get caught being dishonest with the government official, your chances of being able to enter that country and not getting a fine are very slim. So unfortunately, there have been a couple cases of that over the years, but 99% of the time, it's fairly simple process.
So when we're talking about promoting in Canada, we're talking about running towns, again, for our international listeners, and I don't mean to, you know, stigmatize America or anything, but a lot of this will focus on the American point of view of things. When you're hearing about independent programs running, you know, there's such a stigma, again, mostly from America, where it's, oh, this, you know, to quote Jim Cornette, this Outlaw Mud show is running, and there's 10 people in a barn out in, you know, wherever, friends and family, and it's just it's a outlaw event, and there's no, you know, promotion behind it. It's just a bunch of jobbers essentially running this program. But when we're talking about independent wrestling here in Canada, even going back to the Stampede days, you know, and I'm talking about the early Stampede days of the 40s, the 50s, there's been some top-notch, high-quality organizations that have run across Canada, organizations like yourself as well, where it's, you know, you're not running a barn in the middle of nowhere, right? This is, you have so much travel to plan for, you have so many venues to book, you have so much talent to put in place. This isn't some mom and pop organization. And I feel like independent wrestling, not so much in Canada, but in other parts of the world, maybe gets such a bad rap as being, you know, low budget or low grade or nobody goes or whatever. And that's simply not the case, is it?
It's a double-edged sword, and that, you know, the extended answer to what you're asking is that, you know, part of why we started CWE is there's a lot of incredible talent in Canada that no one has ever heard of, that no one has ever seen, and sadly, some may never hear of. Just based on our geography, we're in very small markets comparable to the major U.S. markets. We're not affiliated with any major national organizations. So there's a lot of guys here that are extremely talented, and I would go on record saying better than a lot of the talent that are currently on TV now that just don't get their opportunity or just do because they just don't get seen by the right people or they're just not in the right place at the right time. And people who have better geographical location tend to get those opportunities a little sooner than some guys do here. So that's kind of why we started CWE, is to try to bring more attention to Canadian wrestling and you know, spotlight and showcase the talent we have here, because once people kind of catch on to some of these guys, they usually do very well for themselves. You know, Kenny Omega being a great example of that. So there's a lot of talent here. Not to say there's not a lot of shitty wrestling here too. You know, Canada has its fair share of really bad wrestling as well, and that's where it's a double-edged sword. You know, the really good talent doesn't get seen because, you know, we don't have the same reach as some of the other major independent organizations in the U.S., but at the same time, a lot of our bad wrestling doesn't get seen either, which is really good. But with that being said, Canada has a different stigma when it comes to independent wrestling than it does in the U.S., and I can attest to that because, you know, prior to the borders being closed, I wrestle in the U.S. more often than I wrestle in Canada, and America definitely does have some great wrestling fans, very respectful wrestling fans, appreciative wrestling fans, but I would say the casual general public doesn't take wrestling as seriously as a Canadian citizen or wrestling fan does. There, it's very much viewed as kind of that fake wrestling, that phony wrestling, that silly wrestling on TV. You know, just based on years of wrestling kind of being bastardized on national television, it kind of has a stigma to the general public. Where I find that people of Canada, and it was the same way when I was in Japan as well, are very respectful of professional wrestling. They understand that it's entertainment, and they appreciate it for what it is. and appreciate, the effort and the talent and ability that goes into being elite performer. So I think that's the major difference, between Canada and the U.S. and the U.S. compared to other parts of the world, is people understand what wrestling is here, and they appreciate it for that, and they're supportive of it because of that. Where in the U.S. it's like, oh, it's that fake wrestling bullshit, and there's maybe a misunderstanding of exactly the type of art that professional wrestling is, and because of that, there's a lack of appreciation for the effort and ability that goes into perform it at a high level and be successful at a top tier level in the world of professional wrestling. And that is a generalization. Like I said, there is fans that are appreciative and understanding of what it is down there, but as a general population, that's kind of the feeling you get down there compared to fans in other parts of the world.
Just to circle back to the comment you made about Canadian wrestling fans, I think because of organizations like Stampede Wrestling, and especially in Western Canada, there's always been such a Western alienation feel in Canada. Still to this day, we still feel it with the way, Western Canada and the feds do not see eye to eye. We haven't for... Well, I'm 35. It's not been my entire life, for sure. In Western Canada, a lot of our traditions and whatever are so deeply rooted and ingrained. I can remember my Nana and Papa talking to me that they used to watch Stampede Wrestling at home. They would gather their friends together. My Nana and Papa were the only ones of their friends that had a TV, and they would watch it. And so you hear these stories, and then I can vaguely remember when I was a kid, I must have been 4 or 5 at my Nana and Papa's place, and they had wrestling, like WWF that would have been like 89 or 90, and Bret Hart was on TV, and my Papa, I'd never forget, made some offhand comment of, oh, that's Stu's kid, and I didn't get it at the time, right? But now, like, as you get older and you start, learning a little bit about history, and you start realizing just how deep these tentacles go into the grain of Western Canada. It's incredible, which is why I think that there are so many talents from America, from Japan, from Mexico that like to come to Canada to wrestle because of how the fans are here, of how the experience is. Maybe not the travel portion of it, but the experience of being in Canada, being in these small towns, being in front of a fan base that just really appreciates the art form.
100%, and I got 2 responses to that on both the fan side and the wrestler side. And I think that, you mentioned Stampede Wrestling. That's been ingrained in Western Canadian culture, dating back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. So if you grew up in Western Canada, you grew up on Stampede Wrestling. If you look at Winnipeg, Winnipeg grew up on AWA wrestling up until the late 80s. There was monthly events at the Winnipeg Arena that were jam-packed with thousands of people. So at a time where entertainment options were limited, you didn't have the TV available that you have now, or the internet, or different forms of entertainment. Wrestling was a go-to outing for people. So a lot of people in Western and Central Canada, they grew up on professional wrestling. And if you look at the type of product Stampede Wrestling presented, it was a very hard-hitting, innovative, fast-paced style of professional wrestling. If you look at the AWA, it wasn't maybe as aggressive or as fast-paced, but it was definitely presented as very real and very competitive and very athletic. So the wrestling that people grew up on in Canada was taken very seriously. It wasn't treated as a joke. It wasn't treated as phony, fake wrestling. It was treated as a competitive sport presented in the form of entertainment. And that even goes as far as Eastern Canada with Maple Leaf Wrestling in Ontario. So Canadian wrestling fans and the Canadian population in general, I think, were brought up on respecting professional wrestling for the art form it is and the ability it takes to perform it at a high level. And I think that's why, wrestling fans are so supportive of it here. And I can attest now from, promoting well over 600 events across the country, it doesn't matter what part of the country you go to. I can stop in a random business and start talking to them about the wrestling show coming to town. And chances are 4 to 5 people got a wrestling story. You bring up professional wrestling, they all remember watching a certain product as a kid, or getting together with their dad and watching it, or at their grandparents, or going to the arena with their friends. Everyone has some era of wrestling they grew up on, or some wrestling memory that they cherish. Even if they're a wrestling fan now, that they still remember to this day. that they were brought up on. So I think, there's a lot of nostalgia and a lot of feel good for people when it comes to Canadian wrestling, just because it was something they were brought up on. And because it was presented so seriously, that's like, my second half of the comment. Prior to the lockdown closing up the borders here, I think in 2019, we had something like 10 different countries represented on these tours, from all over Europe and Mexico and Japan. And these were people that came to us. These weren't people that we sought out. These were wrestlers that came to us and said, we want the opportunity to wrestle in Canada. And that's been a constant now for, your 12 years of operating CWE. People in the wrestling business have wrestling in Canada on their bucket list because it has produced such good quality wrestlers for so many decades, and because it's a country that has taken wrestling seriously for so long, very much like Japan's a bucket list place for a lot of wrestlers, because, you have these places that have such fond memories of wrestling being treated like wrestling. And you look at Stampede Wrestling and the product they produce and the AWA, and then you start looking at the wrestlers that came out of Canada, from, Bret and Owen Hart to the new generation of guys like Chris Jericho or now Kenny Omega. There's just been decades, and there's so many more. I could probably list dozens and dozens of top wrestlers who are from Canada that went on to be major stars around the world, and they're all appreciated for being good quality professional wrestlers and being, the very best of their class. So I think there's a special place in people's hearts for Canadian wrestling, and they want to be able to experience it and kind of check that off on their list and say, hey, I wrestled there too.
So it's funny you mentioned that. I'm going to play a clip here, and it's from Stampede Wrestling. This would have been in 83, I believe. And when Stampede used to run, there used to be the Calgary Stampede as well. And for anybody who's not familiar with this is a big-time international event where you're doing, oh God, anything you could possibly equate to being a cowboy is done at the Stampede, or done at the Calgary Stampede. There's chuck barrel races, there's horse racing, there's all kinds of fairs, all kinds of festivals, whatever. And
gangbangs in the back alley with cowboy hats.
And when Stampede Wrestling used to run, they would always run a huge monster show every time at that location or at that event, right? And they would get top, and when we're talking top talent, we're not talking just, ham and eggers from whatever, insert your favorite promotion here. We're talking about some of the biggest stars in wrestling, period. So I'm going to play this clip for you. I want to get your take on it on the other side of it.
Let's hear it.
Now, in this clip, for everybody listening at home, you're going to hear the voices of Stampede Wrestling's own Ed Whalen. You're going to hear, obviously, Stu Hart, the topic of our current conversation. And you're also going to hear Ed Schober. Now, interesting note about him, he is the NWA promoter from Hanover, Germany. And he, again, I was talking about Stu's connections to the NWA, both with my conversation with Danny and with my conversation with Ashley. It's very interesting to see that, the tendrils of the NWA reached this far into Canada, and thus the NWA is trying to send talent from other regions of the world, not just America, not just Japan, but Germany as well, into Canada for training. So we're going to get to this interview and then get back to Danny's thoughts on the other side of it.
Ed Schober of Hanover, West Germany, is one of the world's most outstanding wrestling promoters. What is Ed Schober of Germany doing in the Calgary area right now? Well, he's scouting talent for an international tournament in Germany. Maybe before I get to talk to Eddie, I should introduce the people. From my far right, promoter Stu Hart, Mr. Schober, and Alderman Gordon Shrake of Calgary. First of all, Gordon, if I might step in front of you, Mr. Schober, it's good to see you in our part of the world. You have a marvelous reputation worldwide, and I know you're looking for talent, right?
I'm looking for talent, and I know that my friend Stu Hart has some of it. And just for the big tournament in Hanover, I will take his sons and some of the you guys you have seen today here.
Well, Stu Hart, it's a pleasure to have a man like Mr. Schober in this area.
He's got a tremendous reputation for fair play and bringing in the finest wrestlers in the world in Hanover. And we're very fortunate that we've been able to send some of our boys like John Quinn and Archie the Stomper and Mr. Hito.
Right.
and Mr. Gagne, they've all been over there, and they've been very, very pleased.
Well, we're certainly pleased to have him here. And I know that Gordon Schrake, on behalf of the city of Calgary, has a welcome to our German visitor. Gordy?
Yes. Actually, on behalf of members of the City Council and the Mayor and our Boxing and Wrestling Commission, I want to extend to you a little token. It's a symbol of our Western hospitality, one of our City of Calgary white hats.
Okay, Alderman Schrake reaching in there, and oh, that's a beautiful hat. Beautiful thing. Now, just
I think he can't go by without a tie, so
we're going to do the string tie business as well. And I wonder if his, have you parked his horse outside?
Okay, so when you get your cowboy boots on, we got your horse out there. But our best to you, and welcome to our fair city there.
Thank you very much. Okay. Ed Schober of Hanover, Germany. Gordy Schrake, Alderman of the City of Calgary, and promoter Stu Hart. Now, while I've got a moment here, I do want to tell you that next time around, that's next week for those people in the Calgary area, talk about the stars of Stampede Wrestling. We're going to have the world champion Harley Race. We're going to have the former champion Dory Funk. They will collide head on. And I'll tell you, that'll be quite a match because both of them are magnificent wrestlers. Now, beyond that, Harley Race later will defend against either Mr. Sakurada or Leo Burke. They will meet in the final event of tonight's card. Andre the Giant is coming to this territory, all 7 feet 6 inches and 460 or 70 pounds of him. Big chunk of man, and without question the biggest draw in the wrestling game today. We will have Nelson Royal, the world junior heavyweight champion. He will either meet the Dynamite Kid or Norman Frederick Charles, depending on what happens here. We will have the most outstanding wrestling midgets in the world. So you people in the Calgary area better brace your feet because we're going to have quite an onslaught of talent. Maybe you better grab those tickets too. They'll be, the bouts will be staged during those 2 Fridays of Stampede Week here in the city of Calgary. So don't forget, that's Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr., Nelson Royal, the world junior champion, Andre the Giant, the wrestling midgets. The lineup of talent goes simply on and on and on. You'll be guaranteed some super Stampede excitement if you'll come on down and see the stars of Stampede Wrestling in action. The 2 Fridays of Stampede Week, some tremendous action here in the city of Calgary at the Calgary Stampede.
They're bringing in NWA champion Harley Race. They're bringing in Dory Funk Jr. They're bringing in Andre the Giant. All these top tier names. And it's funny, like, just going back to our earlier conversation about, you know, Canadian wrestlers getting exposure elsewhere and wrestlers wanted to come to Canada for the same exposure in front of the fans. It's just, this is something that's been happening since, you know, the 40s. It's been a constant influx and outflux of people who just mean so much to the business, who either want to come to Canada or, you know, for training or to get experience in the programs or even just to be a part of the scene. Like, it's not something that's just, I know a lot of people are on the Kenny Omega bandwagon right now, and for, you know, good reason. He's one of the best in the world. But this didn't start, you know, in 2003 when Kenny started training, right? This is something that's been happening for years and years and years, and I find it so interesting that it's still something that's prevalent in wrestling today, that people are still wanting to come to Canada. They hear about the legacy. They want to be a part of it. They want to cut their teeth. They want to see what it's like. It's just, to me, it's incredible.
Yeah, well, that's something we had to, you know, kind of rejuvenate. That was something that, you know, just boggled my mind as I was coming up as a professional wrestler, that connection didn't really exist anymore. You know, when you look at Stampede Wrestling specifically, you know, Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, like, they were brought in as young kids from England. and became stars over here and polished themselves. It was quite common that New Japan Pro Wrestling would send talent on their excursion to Stampede Wrestling. It's, where the likes of Drew Schlager went on his first, international trip and learned the business before becoming a big star over in Japan. So it was quite common that companies internationally would send their talent over to season them and get them ready and polish them up so they can work with anybody of any style from any part of the world before they got a major run in their country. So that was something that was common practice, and that's something that kind of disappeared, and it probably kind of disappeared because the territory system disappeared and there wasn't as much work or opportunity. So that's something that we kind of wanted to bring back with Canadian Wrestling's Elite, and why we have been so open to having talent from around the world come in here and perform with us and hopefully open some doors the other way. And, just in the last 10 years alone, like through CWE, wrestlers have gotten WWE opportunity, Ring of Honor opportunity, Japan opportunity, opportunity in Germany. Right before the lockdown, some of our guys were scheduled to go down and wrestle in Mexico because of contacts they made here. So that was something we were very proud of and something we were very much trying to put together because there wasn't a lot of that going on. So that's something that we very much, will continue to, once things open up, try to present for people, because there wasn't a lot going on for Canadian wrestlers. There really wasn't a way to get out and do anything if you didn't have the right contacts to do it. So that's something that we're very proud of, that we've been able to kind of present and offer wrestlers to come up here and do and kind of exchange that favor back and forth for different talent. Just keeping with Stampede Wrestling, what kind of lessons do you think that either wrestlers today or people looking to get into the business, whether it's promoting or, announcing or refereeing, what lessons can they take from Stu Hart and what he did with Stampede Wrestling? Oh, man, so many. Just like, the way we've set up our business model to try to be sufficient in covering so many miles is definitely, definitely a page out of Stu's book and how he operated his territory. And it may seem like, I don't know if it's a negative, but, after reading so much about the territory, Stu specifically, and, different books by different members of the family that kind of talked about how the business was operated and how it had, fluctuated up and down over the years. It was kind of an inspiration to see that it wasn't all glory all the time. Because when you look at a Stampede Wrestling and the success it had and the huge crowds and the huge stars it produced, you have it up on a pedestal of how big of a company and how big of a company it was and what it meant to professional wrestling and its contribution. But realistically, there was a lot of struggles and hardships along the way, and even with a lot of incredible talent, it was still a grind to be successful. There was years that his family, owned limos and sports cars, and there was other times that they were, sharing clothes because, houses weren't up to where they needed to be the previous years. They had to take a dip in their lifestyle. So I think if anything, it was, a good eye-opening experience to be realistic to what the business is, how it can fluctuate, that it's going to be good and it's going to be bad sometimes, and it's not necessarily a reflection of the product, but just a reflection of the business and how it cycles and how to stay on top of it and be successful. So I think I've taken a lot of inspiration and optimism from the Stampede Wrestling territory to know that, it's not, just because sometimes can be rough and there could be some struggles along the way, that it's not necessarily a certain, and it's not always going to be for the long term, and you just got to keep pushing through and present the right talent and keep building your brand, and it will stand on its own. And that's, that inspiration is what has kept us going for 12 years and has kept us expanding into different markets, and knowing that, just because, we had one rough go around or a couple month go around that was a little harder than usual to pay the bills, it doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. And if we're confident in our product and the talent that we're presenting, it's going to come around full circle, and it more times than not always does. So I think that's been a big contribution from Stampede Wrestling to us, is just that motivation to keep on pushing through the hard times and the good.
Obviously, Stu Hart's legacy in Canada is well documented and well cemented. You would be hard pressed to not, be in a room of 10 people and some of them not, or at least one not know who Stu Hart is, or have a Stu Hart story or the voice or whatever. But what would you say that Stu Hart's legacy is from an international point of view?
If you're going to talk about international point of view, I would probably say his sons. Brett and Owen went on to be two of the biggest stars in, the history of the business, and two of the highest regarded ring technicians in the history of professional wrestling. So I would say Stu's legacy internationally would probably be, his sons and their ability and how they went on to be such major stars that have, captivated an entire generation of wrestler. Because when you look at guys like Brett and Owen, especially, in the 90s when it was a big man's game and, being a smaller wrestler, being a technical wrestler was kind of hidden in the background and not being front and center. They definitely changed that. And if you look at a lot of the wrestlers today and the style of wrestling today, a lot of that can be contributed to Brett and Owen's contributions to the business and their style of professional wrestling. And if you were to survey, the wrestlers today, I would say a vast majority, if not all of them, would probably associate Brett and Owen as inspirations to them to get into the business and be able to perform the way they do now, because their style of professional wrestling was very unique and very rare at the time, especially on a national level, and they kind of helped change that landscape.
So as we look to wrap up, obviously in the current COVID environment, it's few and far between that wrestling opportunities are going to present themselves right now. But what are you and the CWE looking forward to moving forward in 2021?
Fingers crossed we can get back in front of a live audience and, a significant amount of people to keep this thing afloat. I would be lying if I would say that this year's been easy. 2020 was supposed to be the biggest year in company history. We're scheduled to, debut in Montreal, like I mentioned. We're, going to be going from 36 events on our tours to 40 plus, and hopefully expanding to Eastern Canada. We, had some major stars that were coming up this way. The tours that we did have scheduled had more Ring of Honor and international talent booked on it than ever before. So we were really gung-ho to really make a statement and put Canadian wrestling on the map as a premier wrestling country. So more than anything, we're really, really looking forward to getting back to that. Just yesterday we had to cancel 8 events between Manitoba and Alberta. They were the 2 provinces we were still able to produce live events in, and unfortunately they both extended or put restrictions in place that completely axed having any kind of public gatherings. So there were our 2 lifelines left. So it was a bit of a depressing day yesterday and today having to make that announcement, but we know it's not going to be forever. It might be long term, it might be short term, but it's not going to be forever. So we're just trying to keep our head above water, keep our brand relevant, and keep wrestling in people's minds, because as soon as we do have the opportunity to get on the road again, we'll be the first ones there. CWE's been at the forefront of Canadian wrestling. We've produced over 20 events this year in front of a live crowd, which is more than any other organization in the country, with more markets ran than any other, company in the country. Just trying to work with what we're given. We haven't been given a lot. More times than not, it's like we're allowed 100 people at max. Which is nowhere near enough to pay the bills. And, at that point, it's more of a passion project of just being able to get in the ring and still perform and keeping the brand alive. But luckily, we've got a good team of hungry wrestlers that are all about that want to wrestle regardless of how many people are in the audience, because they love what they love what they do first and foremost. And secondly, they want to keep this brand alive and keep it growing. So we more than anything are just waiting for that opportunity. As soon as they give us that green light to, hey, you can go and operate here or operate there, you better believe CWE will be there, and we will have a ring set up and we're providing live wrestling. We're just waiting on the go-ahead.
On a personal note, I will say that I've been to, I couldn't even count how many CWE shows, and I've always had a tremendous time. You guys always have just an incredible amount of especially local talent, because there's been a lot of talent that you guys have had that I haven't seen before till you see him on a CWE show and you're like, oh man, this guy's fantastic, and then you see him at a different show where you catch him on Twitter, and now they're over in Germany, for example, or they're somewhere else, right? It's that real connectivity that I find with the fans in CWE that is so important, and I really do hope that when all this thing is said and done, you're able to pack the houses again. Until then, where can fans find you personally right now?
You can find me personally on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Hotshot Danny Duggan. And you can find CWE at CWE Canada at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.
And what's the website for CWE Canada?
CWECanada.ca, or you can pay attention to CWEtickets.com, as that's where they're also listed when live events are happening and good to go.
Danny, I very much appreciate having you on the program tonight.
I really appreciate you having me and supporting and promoting Canadian wrestling. It truly is appreciated.
Now, before we move on to the main event of this evening's program, we're going to play some classic audio from Stampede Wrestling. Now, in this clip, you're going to hear a voice of Stampede Wrestling, Ed Whalen, getting involved in the action, if you will. And this is a subject that is going to be covered in great detail with my next guest on the program. But in this clip, you're going to hear Ed Whalen, like I said, the voice of Stampede Wrestling, getting into it with Bulldog Bob Brown. He's in the process of saving Chris Benoit from getting jumped by Bulldog Bob Brown's stable. So you're going to hear a bunch of commotion. But more importantly, I want you to listen to not just Ed Whalen. I know he gets very involved in this, and he's not everybody's cup of tea. Although in Canada, he was extremely important to that brand. But what I want you to listen to is the crowd. And that's something that Danny and myself were talking about. The Canadian crowds are quite a bit different from any other types of crowds, and they really haven't changed in the last, 50 years of professional wrestling or sporting in general, right? A rowdy crowd in Canada is a rowdy crowd, and they're ready to get to it. So I'm going to play this clip. I want you to pay attention to the crowd. I also want you to pay attention to the names that are listed at the end of the program, just again reinforcing that idea that a lot of top talent, a lot of top names came through the Stampede Wrestling territory and were there for obviously the tutelage of Stu Hart and the promotional skills of Stampede Wrestling to further their brands. But we're going to get to this classic audio from Stampede Wrestling. Please enjoy. And on the other side, our main event of the evening.
He's getting a little excited. Here comes Duggan. Just a minute. What's going on here? What's going on here? They've got two of them after little Benoit. What's he doing? What do you think you're doing? What are you doing? Doing what you did. You got no business. You got no business doing that, and you know it.
No, just a minute now.
You got no business.
Just a minute. You don't understand.
You don't hold the guy and slap him around like that.
You don't understand.
I
didn't do nothing.
Everything.
Now, just a minute. He came at me.
Darn right I did.
And I had to go.
You
I had to move out of the way.
Around.
Now, just a minute now. Whatever you say don't make a damn bit of difference to me, Eddie.
It makes a difference to me.
So what are you going to do about it?
What am I going to do about it? I know that I can convince the promoter that you will take this guy on. And I hope he cleans your clock. Benoit, giving him a ride. That's what he deserves. That's what you deserve. That's what he deserves, Chris. Take him on. Take him on.
You've gone one step too far, Bob Brown. I'm telling you, you've gone one step too far. Next week, Bob Brown, I want you to put your name on the dotted line. And I'll tell you what, Bob Brown, you're going to be hanging up your boots once and for all. Because when I'm finished with you in this ring, you're going to be on the way to the hospital.
Yeah, I don't want to talk to you. What do you want to say? I won't come down there. You think I want to stand with those guys? What?
What does he want?
He wants you.
Okay, he wants me. Yeah. There's two things. Just a minute now. Don't let me. I want to say one thing. There's two things. If he wants me, I'll agree. But there's two things. Number one, he don't be in his corner. And number two, there'll be no television allowed. Because I tell you what I want to do. I don't want the Bleeding Heart Society and the churchgoers to get after me for what's going to happen to the kid.
Stipulation. I want a bigger microphone, about that long and made out of concrete. Get out of here. Get out of here.
Mamma mia, what a night. I apologize for getting involved. No, I don't know that I can, because I suppose I'd do it again. Benoit's one of my favorite people. He's such a gentleman, and the other guy, there was no call for it. Okay, let me tell you what we've got coming up next week in this arena. What have we got? We've got the Commandos against the Sing Sing boys. That should be quite a tag team battle. Interesting in light of what happened tonight. We've got Benoit against Brown, as you may have noticed. No television. And, of course, Davey Boy Smith. Hopefully he'll be over an ankle injury. Hopefully it's not a fracture. He'll be going in against Steve Blackman. And a big man, 6'6", he's way over 300 pounds, goes by the name of the Grim Reaper, and he's masked, will make his debut in this territory. Poof. Anyway, we shall see you next week at this same time, but in the meantime and in between time, that's it. Another edition of Stampede Wrestling. Bye-bye now.
For this portion of the program, I'm very pleased to be joined by really the preeminent author of the Stampede Wrestling territory, specifically, the history of it. This man has written, honestly, probably as close to the Bible of Stampede Wrestling as you could ever possibly get, and I'm very happy to have him join me tonight, the author of Pain and Passion, the history of Stampede Wrestling. And this is Heath McCoy on the line. How are you doing?
Very good.
So, Heath, what in the world would get you to write this book on Stampede Wrestling?
For one, I grew up with Stampede Wrestling. I'm a Saskatoon kid. I grew up in the early, I was at the right age in the early 80s, 10, 11 years old sort of thing. And, Stampede Wrestling came on every afternoon on Saturday afternoon on TV, 2 o'clock every afternoon, Saturdays. So, I'd watch it with my friends, beat up my brother, pretend to be one of the Hart brothers and beat up my little brother. And, my friends and I would play it at recess and stuff. It was Stampede Wrestling was a Western Canadian, cultural staple, right through the 50s, 60s, 70s. I used to watch it with my grandfather, actually, because he had been watching Stu's product ever since the 50s. And I watched it with my dad, and it's just one of those, it was such a cultural staple of certainly Western Canada, and then of course the legend of Stampede Wrestling went all over the world. So I was a fan first and foremost, and then as life progressed, I became a journalist. I was a writer for the Calgary Herald. I was doing an internship at the Calgary Herald in the May of 1999, actually, when Owen Hart died at Kansas City Wrestling Ring. And I'm there in Calgary, the home of the Harts. The next day, they sent me over to the Hart House as a cub reporter to cover this story. So it's quite surreal. Suddenly I'm there at the Hart House, and I'm surrounded by the Hart family and all these other wrestlers that are showing up, and these guys that I grew up watching. And I followed Bret Hart and Owen Hart and the British Bulldogs and everything, and followed their careers closely. And as they kind of graduated Stampede Wrestling and went to the WWF, and suddenly I'm there. And it's this tragic time, and I'm covering this story with the family. And it was the if you recall, that was the biggest news story of the day at that time. There was no bigger story in the world. I mean, media from all over the world flocked to that story of the wrestler that died in the mishap in the ring in Kansas City there. And of course, it was a huge story in Calgary, because the Hart family was such a celebrity family in Calgary, and had been for decades. So it's this major story, and I'm sitting there, and I'm talking to the Harts, and I'm talking to all these different wrestlers, surrounded by reporters coming from all over the world. I mean, they had somebody from Good Morning America and Entertainment Tonight coming in, and the CBCs and NBC, ABC. Reporters are coming in from all over the world that day. But I kind of, I think I understood something about the wrestling world and the Harts, the world of the Harts, and who the Harts were, and their legacy with Stampede Wrestling. I understood something that maybe the other reporters around me that day didn't. And so I got to know the family a little bit, and this was an ongoing story, of course. This went on and on as the Harts sued Vince McMahon, and the Hart family was torn apart. This story went on and on and on, and the saga of the Hart family went on for years afterwards, and it kind of became my story. at the Herald by and large. And the more I covered it, the more I got to know the Hart family, the more they kind of came to, know me, and I think some of them, they trusted me and they liked me. And I got to know more about the amazing story of this family and this Stampede, and the inside story of Stampede Wrestling. And I just thought, this is an epic story. I thought I'd see it like it's almost like a movie. It's almost like a movie. It's like the Godfather of wrestling. And I thought to myself, like, this is an incredible book. I have to write this book. And so that's what provoked me to start writing the book.
So 2 things I just want to touch on. The day that Owen passed away, it's crazy because I'll never forget it. We were out at my cabin, and my cabin, or my parents' cabin, however you want to phrase it, is about an hour and a half away from Winnipeg. And this is back in the day of the old rabbit-eared television sets, right? Because out there was no cable, there's no satellite, you had a phone line that mostly worked, and you had CBC on with the rabbit ears, right?
Yeah.
And we were having like a late night snack or whatever, and the National came on, and the first story on the National was Owen Hart passing away.
Yeah.
And all of us were like my nana and papa, my parents, my 2 brothers, myself. We just, everybody stopped, and it's man. Even thinking about it today, it's incredible. Like, just first off, how many lives he touched is, incalculable, really.
Yeah.
But just how everything across Canada and a lot of parts of the world just stopped, and it was like, wait, what? Because nobody had ever, like, what do you say? Everybody was in shock and disbelief, and I can only imagine.
It was an absolute shock, yeah.
Oh, and I couldn't even put myself in your shoes as like, okay, here you go, get in there and get us a story. That's insane.
Yeah, it was something, and you talk about the shock of that day for you and for the whole world that day. Really, whether you're a wrestling fan or not, everybody gravitated to that story that day because it was such a sensational and a tragic story. And I was in ground zero. And just having grown up with these guys, watching these guys as my heroes, the Hart family and Davey Boy Smith and all these people, just being there that day, I'm really very well aware of who Stu Hart was as well from watching Stampede Wrestling, and I'd seen the documentary that came out a couple years before that, or a year before that, or whatever, Wrestling with Shadows.
Yes, Wrestling with Shadows. Yeah.
Yeah, and that gave you a really in-depth view of who Stu Hart was. And what a formidable character he was, and he was just you thought of him as this powerful, strong man. And I remember being at the Hart House that day, and talking to the family, talking to all the brothers and sisters of the Hart family, and talking to the different wrestlers, and I was there for a couple hours. Really, they welcomed all the media into their home, and they were so gracious, and as they were suffering. But for the longest time, you didn't see Stu, you didn't see Helen. We were there, Ed Whalen came around, the announcer for Stampede Wrestling.
Yes.
And I'm meeting all these people and talking to these people. And then suddenly, Stu and Helen came down the stairs. Everybody was in the Harts, the Hart Mansion living room, basically. And they came down the stairs from their bedroom. They'd been up in their bedroom, convening, I guess, and they're suffering over the loss of the youngest son, and they came down the stairs, and it was such a powerful moment. There was such vulnerability in them. Helen just seemed crushed and in shock, and Stu, this big, powerful man, I mean, the same, his eyes, were glassy, sort of. It looked like he maybe been crying, and he came down, and he was just, I don't know, it was such a powerful moment. I hope I'm describing it doing justice to the moment that it was, because it was just a powerful, poignant moment to see this powerful man coming down the stairs, literally crushed by what had just happened.
It's, you were there, and even hearing you describe it, I could only imagine, right, what it was like, what the feeling was in the room, and just you get so used to seeing these people on television, through the years in different whether it's in the ring or it's interviews or it's how many times do you see Stu Hart on CBC just as in a news program, right?
Yeah.
Away from whether he's talking about Calgary Stampede or whatever, not even just specifically wrestling. We spend so much time getting to know these people, and then something like this happens, and it's like they're almost unrecognizable, because it's like, this is not who I'm used to seeing, right? This is a totally different side from, the larger than life Stu Hart. Now he's just a father who lost a child. It's heartbreaking.
It really was. There was this one point there, I think it was set up, maybe a little bit set up as a photo op. But Stu comes downstairs, and Brett had just arrived at the house. He showed up on his motorcycle, I believe, and everybody kind of clears the room for Bret Hart to come in and everything, and at one point they come. I believe they went into the the famous dining room where they would host all the wrestlers and have their big dinners with the Hart family and everything. And
Yep.
They went in there and they had some photo albums out, family photo albums, and Stu's going through the photo albums and looking at pictures of Owen, and he's tearing up a little bit, as much as possible for a man like Stu to tear up, and because he was a tough man. And Brett came up behind him and Brett was tearing up, and he put his hand on Stu's shoulder, and Stu touched Brett's hand, and it was just I'll never forget that picture as well, and which circulated all over the world. It was just such a power. Yeah, they say sometimes a picture can say 1,000 words, and that was one of those pictures. Just a powerful thing.
So when you were getting the idea together to do this book, did you have an issue getting into the past of Stampede Wrestling? Did you have any roadblocks that prevented you from getting information? Was there anything, because in Canada, maybe not so much nowadays, but definitely still back then, kayfabe was a big deal still.
It's still happening, yeah. Like when I talked to Archie the Stomper Goldie, for example, he didn't give me much. He was it was over the phone, and he was in where the heck was he living at that time? Somewhere in the south, somewhere in the southern states anyway. And he didn't give me much. Like he had the kayfabe mentality.
Yeah,
going.
yeah.
But no, I don't know. I think it's because I was a reporter. I had some legitimacy to me because I was a reporter with the Calgary Herald, and I started to get to know these people through the Harts, and so some of these different wrestlers. So for the most part, people opened up to me. The Hart family certainly opened up to me. Originally, I thought, I just want to write a book about the death of Owen Hart because that's such a powerful moment, and then sort of the time passed on that, and then I just kept doing stories about the Hart family. And one day I sat down with Bruce Hart, actually one of the Stu's sons, who had been a wrestler in Stampede Wrestling, and I sat down with Bruce Hart in a restaurant one night, and we talked for like 3.5 hours. I just pressed tape on the tape recorder, and we taped and taped. And he just told me the whole story. So not a large portion of the family story and the Stampede Wrestling story, and I just thought, man, this is an incredible story. And I'd had some great talks with Natty Neidhart and everything, and I just thought, yeah, I have to. This is a bigger story than just the story of Owen Hart. I want to tell the entire story of the entire history of Stampede Wrestling, and which the Harts are so ingrained in.
So I guess.
And in terms of story, and I cut you. I went off track a little.
That's okay. Hey, that's all right.
Yeah. So yeah, I didn't get a lot of resistance. I got a little bit of resistance here and there, and people that didn't. There's the odd person, and wrestling's full of as we know, wrestling's full of a lot of bullshitters as well. So
yes,
I got some people that told me stories that were really dubious. And I really treated it like I want the true story. So I treated it like a reporter. I didn't just take one person's word for a story. Like I got the perspective from as many different people as I could, in different situations. And I spent a lot of time, by the time I started writing the book, Stu had already passed away and Helen had passed away. I met them when Owen died, and I met them a couple times after that, but I never really got to interview them specifically for the book. But there were so many, on-record interviews that they had done over the years that I was able to get into their side of things, and I just I had a lot of people that really opened up for me, and then a lot of people that kind of, you know, gave me the kayfabe stuff, and I had to investigate a little bit to find out the true story about it, and yeah, so it was a challenging book, and it was sort of my hobby for about 2.5 years there. It was just my hobby. I would find different wrestlers to interview on the weekend, and I would go transcribe their interviews, and I was just compiling these interviews thinking this is going to be a great book. And then when I got the book deal, suddenly I had 4 months to turn in the first draft. So I'm like, oh boy, yeah, it was crazy. And then I was like, okay, now's the time to start. You know, and I still had interviews to do. I still had research to compile. So I was just like, it was an intense time. But yeah, I got her done. So
I got to ask, and I'd be ridiculous if I didn't. Did you know what you had when you had finished writing? Like, did it hit you like how, I don't know, how complete of a story you had assembled, or was this something where, you know, you finish the book and you take some time away from it, and then, you know, people start, you know.
No, I think I knew that I had to really, you know, without not trying to sound like, you know, blow my own horn or anything like that, but I really did
No. Please put yourself over. It is a wrestling podcast after all.
Yeah, I really feel like I had a powerful story. I went in knowing I had a powerful story to tell. And I really did see it as not just a history, not just a lot of wrestling books, you know, are either just sort of encyclopedias of what happened, or they're sort of, you know, these biased accounts by wrestlers telling their side of the story, trying to bury all the enemies and stuff. And I really wanted to tell a journalistic story, but also I had like a cinematic vision for it too, because I do think it's a really powerful story. It's not just a story about wrestling. It's a story about family, and a family business, and what happens to the family business when it becomes really corporate, when the business that they're in becomes incredibly corporate. And yeah, that's the story that I was sort of telling. When I joke that when I say it's the Godfather, I saw it as the Godfather of the wrestling world. I'm only half joking. I do think there's a Godfather. You know, the Godfather is all about family and how family's connected and to this you know, this shady business of the mafia. Well, the Hart family is connected to the crazy business, this crazy sort of carnival business of the wrestling world, and and they love the business, and it made the family in a lot of ways, but it also broke the family in a lot of ways. There's a real tragic element to the story.
It's interesting that you say that last portion there, that it made the family, but it also broke the family, and that's one of my favorite books in wrestling, or, you know, even just in general, is Bret Hart's book, and where, you know, he goes into detail about how, you know, events inside of Stampede Wrestling really put him at odds with the other brothers, right? When they had the restart, and we'll get into that later, when there was the failed restart, how that started a bunch of conflict. Obviously, the Owen Hart stuff just blew everybody apart. But yeah, it's Stampede Wrestling was much more than just, you know, a wrestling organization. It was much more than just this event or this time in Canada's history, really, that brought certain people together, and maybe it meant something, maybe it didn't. No, this thing brought generations of people together. It helped foster the relationships of generations of people, including the family itself. And I mean, what else can you say? If an organization can do something like that, it has to stand at least high on the shoulders of some of the most influential organizations of all time in professional wrestling.
It really is, and that's another reason I wanted to tell the Stampede Wrestling story too, because, you know, Calgary, especially in the heyday of Stampede Wrestling, 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, it's not Los Angeles, it's not New York, and it's not Toronto, and it's not Montreal. Like, the Calgary was considered a bit of a backwater. You know, not a lot of people knew about Stampede Wrestling. I mean, to a lot of people, they only heard about Stampede Wrestling once Owen and Bret, you know, were in the WWF, and they had their little feud, they had their giant feud there.
Yes.
You know, Gorilla Monsoon and Jerry Lawler and all these guys would be talking about Stampede Wrestling and the legacy of Stu Hart and all that kind of stuff. So I think the most wrestling fans around the world know Stampede Wrestling that way. but they don't know the actual Stampede Wrestling and the actual greatness of Stampede Wrestling. And that's something I really wanted to get across too. And actually, Stampede Wrestling was very for this little kind of backwoods territory, which it was in so many ways. It was so influential in so many ways. If you look at some of the guys that came out of Stampede Wrestling, like the Dynamite Kid is a huge one that just revolutionized the wrestling business. Wayne Coleman, Superstar Billy Graham, who went on to be Superstar Billy Graham, got started in Stampede Wrestling. And I mean, this is the guy that was the prototype that sort of influenced, Hulk Hogan and Jesse the Body Ventura. Like, how much more influential can you get in the DNA of wrestling than that?
Well, even you have
guys like Abdullah the Butcher. He didn't get started in Stampede Wrestling, but he had some of his early, matches and really built himself in a lot of ways in Stampede Wrestling. And just it was just such an influential territory in so many ways. One thing I when I'm talking about the influence of Stampede Wrestling, I always think about, if you look at the greatest tragedies, in wrestling history, you've got Benoit, you've got or the greatest scandals, I guess, in wrestling. You've got the Benoit tragedy, the Owen Hart tragedy, and the screw job in Montreal. And these are centered around Stampede Wrestling guys, if you want to look at how influential Stampede Wrestling was. And then if you look at, and I think you can include the Dynamite Kid in there too, not as a tragedy, but in the way he influenced sort of the high-flying, smaller wrestlers that we see today. I mean, he was the first one that ushered that stuff into North America in a large way. And a Stampede Wrestling guy.
Well, and even somebody like Liger from Japan, who really totally got his, big break, if you will, in Calgary. A lot of the times that's what they would do. New Japan would send talent over that needed that seasoning, needed that, international flavor. What better place would there be than Calgary, really, with the amount of talent that you named, like 6-7 top dog names in wrestling. You also had guys like, you had Bad News Allen was there, and he was just incredible talent. It wasn't just the talent, but it was also how they were presented, how they were allowed to wrestle there. It was something totally different. It was that very much that NWA meets like not the performance part of WWF, but that, the larger scale events, right? You had a lot of the events held with this Calgary Stampede, for example.
Yeah.
So we're not talking like, you're not working in front of 10 people in some barn somewhere. I know that's always the common misconception about, independent shows in Canada, for example. That was not what this was, and you really had such an influx of international talent and talent that wanted to come here, learn the style, learn what it was to, wrestle for this monster Stu Hart, if you will.
Yeah, it was a training ground. It was a backwater sort of territory, but people were sent to, young junior wrestlers, up and coming green guys were sent to Stampede Wrestling for two reasons. One, to go down to that dungeon and train with Stu.
Yes.
Not necessarily Stu, but not always Stu, but sometimes Stu's son or Stu's, the guys who worked with Stu or whatever. But often you go down there and you'd be treated to being stretched and tortured and twisted into a pretzel by Stu. And that was sort of a rite of passage that if you were going to make it in this world, in this wrestling world, you had to be able to survive that, for one thing. And then the Stampede Wrestling territory itself was another sort of hurdle, because it was a smaller territory, so you could go there and sort of kind of feel your way, make your kind of build yourself up and kind of get your feet wet as a wrestler. And then it was also like such a harsh territory, because you had to survive that territory was difficult, just because you're in the Canadian prairies. It's the territory is largely in Alberta and Saskatchewan, so you'd go on these these prairie skating rink roads, going around the Stampede Loop week after week, and the key towns were always Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Regina, and then little the Medicine Hats and the towns in between, sort of thing, and around and around and around that loop, and just putting in hundreds of miles each day on these these days. There were so many car crashes in the history of Stampede Wrestling.
Yes, that's true. Yeah,
fatal accidents and everything. Just driving around those sort of skating rink roads. And it was so, and just to live in that, to be able to survive that, it's kind of a harsh working environment, and that's sort of the way guys were sent in there to sort of break into the business. If you can survive Stu and you can survive Stu's territory, then you can maybe survive this business.
It's funny you talking about the travel. Later in this program, I have a guest on, and we go into detail about one of their tour dates or tour schedules, if you will, and it's about as close to the Stampede. Listen to me talk. Jesus. The Stampede Wrestling tour schedule as you're ever going to get in modern terms of it. But the amount of miles traveled to go from, small town to small town is incredible. We get into that later in the program. But it's funny, you hear guys talking about how it was back in the 80s or the 70s. I know that Canada's progressed 40 years, but travel has not progressed that much. And we still have a lot of the same weather conditions, especially in Calgary, into the BC area as well. Weather out there can change on a dime, and when you're 8 hours into a 10-hour car ride and you're stuck in the middle of a snowstorm, it's incredible that there hasn't been more tragedy and more accidents in professional wrestling just from the travel time.
My parents still live in Saskatoon, and I live in Calgary. Just to drive back and forth, you want to know what white knuckling is. Drive that drive in the middle of a blizzard. It's brutal. And these guys did it week after week. That kind of drive.
I was just gonna say, now do that drive with about 10 ornery wrestlers in the vehicle.
Yeah. No doubt, or a drunk Harley Race at the wheel.
Oh, Jesus Christ! Yeah. So I guess to further contextualize the story of Stampede Wrestling, we should kind of go to the start of how it all came together. So we're gonna backtrack a little bit, a couple of years, if you will, to 1947.
Sure.
So 1947 was when Stu Hart had traveled, or was wrestling, I should say, in San Antonio, and had the idea, I guess, was that with Larry Tillman, where he had the idea of starting his own promotion?
Well, the way I understand it, so Stu's, he came out of his time in the in the armed forces and during World War II.
Yeah, when he was with the Navy.
And then he went to New York, and he established himself in New York. He fought in Madison Square Garden. I think he fought Gorgeous George and Killer Kowalski and the names of the day. So he established himself as a name there. And as far as I know, I don't think it was San Antonio. I think he was working out of, in 47, 48, he was working out of Great Falls. I might be wrong about that now. Maybe you've challenged me here, but I thought he was working out of Great Falls, Montana with, Larry Tillman and who's the other guy? Jerry Meeker.
Yes, you're correct. Yes. Yeah, it was Montana where he was doing the booking as well. So I guess that's maybe where the seed was planted.
Yeah, well, what happened was he's working for these guys. He's wrestling for Tillman and Meeker, but at the same time, he kind of runs afoul of them as well. It must have been a very weird situation because Tillman and Meeker, they basically had a lock on Western Canada, and it was a bigger territory then too. It wasn't just Alberta and Saskatchewan. They had their tentacles in Great Falls and a little bit further out, but. They were neglecting Edmonton. They considered it sort of a third-rate market or something like that. And so they weren't doing a lot of shows in Edmonton. Meanwhile, Stu is an Edmonton kid, and he's a name. We know that he's this athlete. The people of Edmonton know him as the boy, the hometown boy that made good in New York, sort of thing. So the police chief and the mayor of Edmonton actually reached out to Stu, and they said, listen, Tillman and Meeker aren't booking shows here in Edmonton that much. Why don't we we would like you to start up a grassroots, hometown wrestling promotion. We want you to come in and do that. So he did come in and do that, and he started up Klondike Wrestling.
That's right.
Klondike Wrestling when he started it in Edmonton in 48, I believe. But he did piss off Tillman and Meeker, who he was still working for it in some capacity, because he was threatening their, sort of lock they felt that they had on the territory.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, when when Stu had established Klondike Wrestling, because he was worried about Tillman and Meeker, that's why he originally joined with the NWA, correct?
I don't think that's why. I mean, I think ultimately that's why, but I don't think he joined the NWA.
I'm not. Sorry, I should rephrase. I'm not saying specifically because of those two, but because they had such a stranglehold on the surrounding territories that Stu had wanted to open up. I guess that's kind of maybe that pushed him towards the direction of the NWA.
I think maybe, and I think also it was just beneficial. If you're going to be a promoter, you want to be with the NWA. You want to be in that organization because they're going to give you access to the, the big names, the champs and the champions and everything that you want to bring in.
So, just in case anybody who's listening is not familiar with the NWA, how it used to be, obviously quite different than it is in today's day and age. The NWA had a traveling champion. And so you would have, would it be Harley Race or it'd be Ric Flair, just to note, just a couple of the bigger names. And they would go to each territory and they would, wrestle whoever the local top competitor was. And they would have a series of matches. And obviously the NWA title would never switch. There was quite the bounty attached to it. So yeah. No champion. Was it $25,000 if I'm not mistaken?
I'm not sure about that, but yeah, it was that was the draw of getting there. And also just not just the champ, but some of the bigger names as well. You could get them to come in, and Stu always wanted them to come in for. Once he moved to Calgary, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here because we're talking Edmonton Klondike Wrestling. But once he established himself in Calgary and really started establishing the Stampede Wrestling thing, the time of the Calgary Stampede, that was like Stu's WrestleMania. He wanted to throw all the talent and all the big names he could at that kind of moment. So that's when he would try to pay to get Harley Race, Andre the Giant, that sort of thing. But you needed to, it helped greatly to getting that to be part of the National Wrestling Alliance.
So we're talking 1948 till early 51, maybe 52, he's running Klondike Wrestling out of Edmonton.
Yeah, he's running Klondike Wrestling out of Edmonton and sort of running afoul of Tillman and Meeker at that time. And they consider this like a threat to their dominance in Western Canada. And it wasn't just Stu. There was a lot of other promoters that were trying. This territory was in flux, from what I understand. There was a lot of promoters that were trying to, vultures that were circling, trying to get in there. But Stu had the official sort of welcome mat. He had the mayor of Edmonton, the police chief of Edmonton that wanted him to come in and do this because Tillman and Meeker were underserving the Edmonton market. And then there was a guy that Tillman and Meeker were working with a guy by the name of Darby Melnick who ran shows in Calgary. And there was a situation that happened. I'm not sure when it would have been, 49, 50 maybe. Melnick beat somebody up outside of a restaurant. There was a fight outside of a restaurant. Melnick, beat this guy so bad that he was going to be charged with manslaughter. So this sort of threatens the Calgary territory. And Tillman, I believe it was Tillman, buys out Melnick's share buys out Melnick's share of the Calgary part of the territory, so that he can come in there and start promoting matches in Calgary. And he does that because he wants to prevent Stu from expanding. Because Klondike Wrestling is, he's having a lot of success with Klondike Wrestling in Edmonton, and Tillman doesn't want him to expand into across Alberta, and he doesn't want him to get into Calgary. So so they kind of buy out Melnick's Calgary territory there, so they can stop Stu from coming in. And then Tillman also tried to bully Stu and sort of be a co-promoter with Klondike Wrestling as well. There was a little bit of a battle they were having there, and Stu wouldn't be bullied, of course.
The other name that I've came across and I found super interesting was Vern Gagne, and I didn't realize how far his reach went in terms of how far it went into Canada. I always knew that he ran, well, especially with the AWA, was like Winnipeg, Manitoba in general, was a big stronghold of AWA. But when Vern was with the NWA, he was working with Stu Hart, and I was just, I don't know if I was surprised to hear that he was kind of partnering up with Stu. Maybe that's not the right word. I guess there's the NWA affiliation, but maybe it makes a little bit more sense too in this whole, puzzle that we have right now of who does Stu have in his back pocket to help him out to kind of keep other promotions from running territories or cities that he's trying to establish for his territory. And I was just surprised to come across Vern Gagne as one of those names.
I don't know too much about if he did do some work with Vern Gagne. I don't know how extensive that was or how often they did it or anything. I hadn't heard too much about that actually.
It was from my understanding, at least, it was mostly dealing with Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But still, if you're trying to box some other people out, Montana, geographically speaking, is not too far away from those provinces.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So once again, see, you get into the history of things, and you start really looking at it. You come across that name every once in a while. You're like, wait a minute, and then you go down the rabbit hole. And now you're reading, 6-7 different things, and you forgot what you even started on. But just one of those things that I found interesting in looking into all this.
Now you got me wanting to know more about Vern Gagne and Stu Hart and the kind of team up that would have been. Wow, that's not something I knew very much about. That's interesting.
Hey, if you could learn anything from me, I'm blown away. Like I'm sitting here trying to absorb. I'm being the sponge, if you will, right now in our conversation. So moving forward in time a little bit, I want to talk about when he was it amalgamated or when he bought out Big Time Wrestling. How did that come apart?
Finally, you're talking about when he moves into Calgary, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So finally, in '51, I think so. So Stu and Tillman have basically been headbutting over the expansion of this territory and Stu's place in the territory. They're kind of headbutting, but going back and forth from 48 to 51. And I think Tillman just gets sick of the fight after a while, from what I understand. He just decides, Stu makes him an offer, which was a very great offer, more than the territory was worth at that time. Paid him $50,000, and he was doing the honorable thing, apparently, from what Ross Hart has told me, because he had enough of an expansion and enough respect and everything. He probably could have just put Tillman out of business, but he actually did the honorable thing and he bought Tillman out for $50,000. And then he establishes Big Time Wrestling, which is Calgary based. And it all comes together in '51. At that time, he comes into Calgary, comes in with Big Time Wrestling, which would eventually morph into Stampede Wrestling. Has one of their big opening shows is on the Stampede grounds, which would be the home of Stampede Wrestling.
Yes.
The Victoria Pavilion and the Stampede Corral, and that first match. Or the first, their opening night on the Stampede grounds in '51, they bring in a French-Canadian strongman by the name of Paul Belerjean, who just as an attraction sort of thing. He carries a horse up a ladder in a sling. So it's but they have this big, huge, sold-out match in the corral, and so Stu really comes into Calgary with a bang, and then it's later that same summer that he buys the Hart Mansion as well, which becomes like ground zero for the Hart family, right? This is the sort of the base of operations of Stampede Wrestling. This is where the famous dungeons in the basement. He raises his family, a family of 12 kids eventually, raises them all. This is sort of, so he's really, he's established his roots. He started out in Edmonton in '48 there, and he was an Edmonton kid. But yeah, by '51, Big Time Wrestling and Stampede Wrestling is centered in Calgary from there on in.
So I'm assuming that he would have dropped the name Klondike Wrestling in favor of Big Time Wrestling because of the name recognition and the larger territory that it would have encompassed, I assume.
That's a bit foggy for me. So when he was doing Klondike Wrestling, he was co-promoting with a guy in Edmonton by the name of Al Oming, bodybuilding friend of his who had also been a wrestler, and I think wrestled a little bit at that time still. And so Al Oming was promoting the Klondike Wrestling, but yeah, eventually, I'm foggy about when it actually happened, but eventually, Klondike Wrestling and Big Time Wrestling, as far as I can tell, just become one. Because the records are so foggy and it's hard to find exactly what happened, and there's conflicting accounts and everything. But as far as I know, he Big Time Wrestling becomes the base, and Klondike just becomes a part of it.
So, and the other name that the promotion was known under was Wildcat Wrestling, and I didn't know a whole lot about that. I assume that was just maybe a transition between Big Time and Stampede.
Yeah, so a lot of things transpire. A big thing that happens is so he's running Big Time Wrestling in from 51. Then in 56, the Western Canada finally gets TV. Toronto had TV since from the early 50s, I think. But for a long time there, they didn't. Calgary didn't have its own TV station. They finally get their own TV station in 54. And when TV revolutionizes professional wrestling, by the way, because when TV comes along, the first TV stars, it's people like Lucille Ball and Jackie Gleason and Gorgeous George.
Yes.
Like wrestlers are among the first TV stars. Talk to your grandpa and grandma, and they'll usually say, "Oh, I remember watching wrestling as among the first TV shows we ever watched. Wrestling was a big deal." So it was a huge deal in 56 when Stu gets a TV deal with the Calgary station. And so Big Time Wrestling becomes a fixture of Calgary TV, and gets broadcast all over the place, other places as well. And so he's got two TV shows, sort of a promotional show, just a 15-minute promo show called Meet the Wrestlers, and then Mad Time, which is the big show. It's locally produced by Calgary's, what is today Global TV in Calgary, and he gets his sort of Stu's right-hand man is a wrestler by the name of a wrestler promoter by the name of Sam Maneker, who comes in, and he's, Keith Hart described him as a maestro, the way he, conducted a wrestling show sort of thing. He's sort of Ed Whalen of Stampede Wrestling before
Ed Whalen, yeah.
Sam Maneker was like the focal point. He was the man. He was the guy who could, be the announcer in the show and have the rapport with the wrestlers and whatnot. And it was a super successful show for a while there. These are really high times, and Stu even purchases his own plane so that he can promote shows as far away as Alaska, because that's how big it had gotten at one point there. And then something. This is the oddest thing, but Maneker actually got mad at Stu, felt he was owed a bigger piece of the pie, and he jumped ship at one point. But the show chugs on and keeps doing well. And then in 1960. Iron Mike DiBiase, who is the father of Ted the $1 Million Man DiBiase, yep. He's wrestling there. He's on the show, and it's so odd that this is a scandal when you think about
all the scandals that have happened. Not even just specifically in wrestling, but generally speaking.
It's so bizarre, but his big thing that he says, he's being interviewed. He says, if brains were dynamite, the people of Calgary wouldn't be able to blow their nose. It's somehow in this era, this is a scandal. Such a scandal that it causes Stu to lose his TV license. He actually loses his license for a time there, and it's a real blow to Big Time Wrestling. But he quickly sort of bounces back because there's another TV station in town. He gets a TV deal with them. And they relaunch what is now today's CTV. He starts a new show then, and this time the show is actually called Big Time Wrestling, and then it's a bona fide hit. And they entice Sam Maneker to come back as the announcer, and it's a big hit. But then again in '62, Maneker leaves because this time he's punched in the nose on air by the wrestler Iron Mike Sharp, who goes all the way back to that. I'm sure you probably know the name Iron Mike Sharp, but he punches Maneker in the nose, breaks his nose. Maneker's humiliated and he's angry, and again he thinks Stu's not paying him enough, and he skips town. And this time he takes Stu's plane. I said earlier that Stu had a plane to fly the wrestlers around and stuff. He takes Stu's plane with him, and Stu tries to sue him. But Maneker says, "Well, I claims he's half owner of the plane, and maybe he was because his name is actually on the registration, so Stu's unable to sue him." So, again, Maneker's the big star maker, and he leaves. Stu's lost his plane, so he's starting to struggle a little bit. And then actually, some interesting things happen here. Maneker's replacement is a guy by the name of Ernie Roth, who would later find huge fame in the WWF as the Grand Wizard, who is the manager in the 70s of Superstar Billy Graham. So Ernie Roth comes along, and he's the he's the announcer for a little while, and he's also got a real knack for the TV, and he's kind of doing what Maneker used to do, but he doesn't last long because CTV executives get wind of the fact that Ernie Roth is gay, and they're scandalized by this. They don't want him in town, so they kind of drive him out of town. And the rumor is as well that Sam Maneker actually tipped off CTV, bitter Sam Maneker tipped off the CTV executives that Roth.
Yeah, because he was pissed from the Stu business.
Yeah, I hope I'm not going too in.
No, God no.
Yeah, they drive out Roth, and for a while there, they get another announcer that's sort of a big sportscaster in Calgary by the name of Harry Viney. But the business is starting to suffer at this point. The TV show's not doing too well. Stu's kind of struggling to survive here. He starts co-promoting with All Star Wrestling in Vancouver, but it's sort of a deal which he's got the short end of the stick. So he's losing money left and right. He's hemorrhaging money. So by 64. He's again without a TV show, and this is a terrible time for the Harts. This is the worst time. The Hart kids remember living on clothes, wearing clothes, ill-fitting clothes from the Salvation Army, and barely having enough to eat. And the Hart family is really struggling at this point there. And then it's in 1965 that Ed Whalen, who's such a star of the star announcer of Stampede Wrestling that everybody kind of remembers now. Ed Whalen's a local newscaster for Global TV. And he's friends with Stu, and their friendship goes all the way back to 1951 when he was just a young green kid, Ed Whalen. He used to be the announcer for some of the Saskatoon shows. So they go way back, and now Ed's a big deal in Calgary as the newscaster, and he's got some clout with the TV station. He gets Stu another TV deal with Global TV, and they relaunch in 65 as Wildcat Wrestling. Wildcat Wrestling, they basically rebrand as Stampede Wrestling in 67, 68. And they do so because it makes sense. Stampede, Stu's promotion is totally ingrained within the Calgary Stampede. So it just the matches are on the Calgary Stampede grounds, so it makes sense to be Stampede Wrestling instead of Wildcat Wrestling. So that's my incredibly long story for your question, but it's an in-depth situation.
Well, that's why we bring the experts into into a show like this, because and we had talked off air about when you start looking into things and you start wanting to learn, I could honestly read, if we'll not talk about your book for a second, but you could have read. There's a couple other books on Stu Hart, and I think there's one other one on Stampede Wrestling, or you could go through news archives, or you can go through newspaper clippings or whatever, and you may still not get that amount of detail, right? It's just incredible. Again, kudos to you for being able to accumulate all of it.
Yeah, it was a tough job, and it's hard too, because I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't know much about the Vern Gagne thing, but it's such an in-depth thing, and things and the records are foggy, and you kind of have to go by people's memory that's not always accurate, and so it was a lot of work and a lot of digging through TV station archives and Glenbow Museum archives, and I worked at the Calgary Herald, so I had free reign on the weekends of their archives, and you just have to find this stuff out, and it was really research intensive.
So when we now move forward in time, we're in that 65, 66, 67. I think is when Stampede Wrestling, as it would come to be known, actually takes off. So he has Stampede Wrestling. He has the affiliation still at this point with the NWA. And really the crown jewel of Stampede Wrestling was the affiliation with the Calgary Stampede. And for anybody who, and I talk about this a little bit later on the program with one of our other guests, but if you, whatever you think a Stampede is, times it by 10. Anything you could possibly think that would happen in an event such as that, multiply that by about 10 as well.
Yeah, it's this giant rodeo, basically, that, the Calgary's been, it kind of put Calgary on the map in the earliest days. I mean, Calgary's is a town that, got rich from an oil boom, but, kind of in the early, but it really, before that happened, its roots were, it was sort of a rodeo, sort of a ranching sort of city basically. It was, you know, it was a town of ranchmen, and yeah, so that it had that sort of small town mentality, and Stampede Wrestling had so reflected that sort of Western mentality. I said in my book at one point there that if the WWE, WWF, if you want to compare it to, you know, slick arena rock, Stampede Wrestling was more like a dirty old honky tonk, like a show you'd see in a barn sort of thing, where you very much could expect a fight to break out next to the stage. You know, it was that sort of rough sort of environment, and you know, and there was a crowd that wanted to see a good fight, a good rough fight, and you know, the matches were held in the Victoria Pavilion, which, you know, I've seen wrestling matches in the Victoria Pavilion. I've also seen, you know, sheep shearing competitions in the Victoria Pavilion. It's very much a barn. It's because, you know, it's the middle of the Calgary Stampede, which is a rodeo, so it's it's used for agricultural purposes. And it smelled like a barn too, you know. So you've got that whole mentality, that whole sort of mentality, and then you've got, you know, Ed Whalen, when he became aboard as the announcer of the show. He was a really respected Calgary guy, very good friends with Stu. He was a, you know, local sportscaster, local newscaster, very respected in town, and he had this sort of, he was perfect for his time, for that era, because he was this he sort of had this, you know, down home, sort of almost hokey flavor to the way he would announce. You know, things were, you know, a great match was like a ring-a-ding-dong dandy, and if there was you know, things would be really hokey today, but it really hit home with the audience at the time. Or like,
If
two wrestlers collided in the middle of the ring, it was like a malfunction at
the junction. I was just gonna say, yeah.
And you know, in the middle of, you know, if there'd be a really good rally in the middle of a match, how sweet it is. You know? And he you know, he had to sign off his every week. That's it for another edition of Stampede Wrestling. Bye now. You know, just this hokey sort of delivery he had, but it was so endearing and so charming. And he had this great rapport with the wrestlers too. Certain wrestlers he would have such a funny rapport with. He was a witty guy, and he'd bring out the wit in the wrestlers as well. And so he, in many ways, became the face of Stampede Wrestling. Like the Harts were the mainstays, and Ed Whalen was the mainstays. And everybody else, you know, the way the territory system worked, everybody else would come and go.
Very
guys
interchangeable.
Like my kid, who was pretty much a mainstay. But he'd be in Japan, he'd be here and there. The mainstays of, you know, right back to the roots were Ed Whalen and the Harts and Stu Hart.
So when Stu's running Stampede from the 60s into the 70s, it's my understanding that he would take summers off of touring?
Yeah, actually, at that time he would do it. I can't remember exactly when that stopped, but yeah, for the longest time there, for a couple decades, he would. They would go partway into the summer. Like the Calgary Stampede is usually like the first or second week of July. So that would be, you know, like I say, that was like the WrestleMania of the Stampede Wrestling. You know, he'd get like Harley Race in, or he'd get Andre the Giant in, or he'd get, you know, like celebrity referees would come in, Jack Dempsey, the boxer, and people like that.
Yeah.
And so everything would be thrown into that. And then after that big Calgary Stampede match, you know, held during the Calgary Stampede as one of the attractions of the Calgary Stampede on the Stampede grounds, yeah, then he'd take the summers off, and then they'd start up again in September. And that stopped eventually. Like when I was a kid, that was no longer happening. Like when I was starting watching it in the 80s, 81, like it was all year round. You'd have Stampede Wrestling. But yeah, in the 70s and 60s and 70s, they definitely did that.
So, and that was a Stu call, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
I want to say I read it in Brett's book that during the summers, that's when Stu really wanted to have the family time, and they would go on family road trips, various parts of Canada or whatever. Just, it's interesting. Again, the peek behind the curtain of Stu Hart, the wrestling promoter, the stretcher, the guy who makes guys scream in the dungeon, and then, I'm going to take the summers off and be a family man. Just, the dichotomy is incredible.
It really was. And there was such a domestic side to Stu Hart, too. He really was a family man. And he, it wasn't just for family vacations and whatnot. He also had other business ventures. Like, for a while there was a place, called Clearwater Beach. It was just sort of a hangout where people would come in there, but he owned that at one point there. So he also had other business ventures that he sort of took care of over the summers as well. But yeah, he really was a family man. He really was a domestic guy. It's weird because the Harts have this memory of their dad's, screams coming up from the dungeon. The kids thought it was funny, and they would tape guys getting, tortured down there in the dungeon, guys crying and screaming and begging for their lives and, vomiting and whatever else he was making as their eyes, bloodshot eyes popped out of their heads and whatever Stu was making happen down there. And then at the same time, then he'd come up and he had this domestic side. He was like, Helen was actually the one who would take care of the business side of things. She'd be up in their office there, doing crunching the numbers and all this stuff. And whereas Stu, he would come up there and he used to do Helen and I think his daughters too. He would do their hair, their nails. Imagine that. He was the beautician of the family as well, and he would do, they had this giant industrial kitchen in the Hart mansion there. So he would love to make a huge feast. So he would do that. He'd be in that kitchen all the time doing that as well.
I think it was Jim Cornette might have coined the phrase, he's the most civilized sadist he ever met.
That sounds like it's something Jim Cornette would say. It's very, yeah.
So as we move forward into the later years, into the late 70s, into the early 80s, is that when Stu kind of started to take his foot off the Stampede Wrestling a little bit? That's when he let Bruce and Keith handle aspects of it?
A little bit, yeah. He was, Stampede Wrestling throughout its entire history, like going back to the big time days, I walked you through some of the ups and downs. It was a boom and bust business. And Helen never wanted to be in the business in the first place. She loved Stu, so she went where Stu went.
She tolerated it.
She tolerated it, and it's sort of like she hated it. She hated the business the entire time, and sort of a dark secret of the family. She kind of became an alcoholic, working up there in the office and, sipping the drinks to sort of be able to tolerate what she was handling, what she was living through. She hated the business, so often she was on Stu to sort of get out of the business. So I think and he was getting older by the 70s too, so he was starting to take his foot off the gas a little bit, and his kids were growing up there, and they were starting to get into the business as well, and especially Bruce kind of had these grand aspirations, I think, to take over, to take the business from his father and to run it into the future. Yeah. So but Stu still kept, at least especially in the 70s, Stu was very active in it as well, and him and Bruce would often get into, headbutting over how things were going to go.
So when we move it from the 70s, now we move into the 80s, I believe it was 82 is when Stampede withdrew from the NWA. But I can never find out why they did. I've seen a ton of transcripts of the NWA meetings, and I know that there was a lot of, not issues, but there was a lot of, I don't know what the word you want to look for, help requested from the NWA for Stu Hart in terms of getting in American wrestlers, because at that time, dealing with papers was a big thing. It's not as free of a working environment as it is today for American wrestlers, and I actually have another guest of mine later in the program that talks about that specifically. But so I wonder if there was a little bit of friction from, maybe he's kind of the redheaded stepchild of the NWA.
I think he was. I don't think they were serving him very well. I think that, again, because Calgary had that reputation as being sort of backwater territory, like maybe, Ric Flair didn't want to go there. If you look at the programs, if you look at those big Calgary Stampede programs, for years and years in the 70s, you'd have, the Briscoes would be there.
Yes.
The Funk Brothers would be, Dory Funk and Terry Funk would be there. You'd have Harley Race there. Andre the Giant would come frequently. And as you get into the later 70s, early 80s, that's happening less and less. And yeah, I think that had to have been a bit of a breaking point in the relationship. Was it in 82? Did Stu formally? Here's again something you could maybe teach me. Did he formally cut ties with NWA at that time?
From my understanding, yeah, 82 is when he withdrew his NWA membership, and then
That makes sense,
and then decided to
I'll never
just
forget this. I was a kid watching the show, loving it. 82, somewhere 82 or 83, he brought in Nick Bockwinkel. And even then, I was very aware, Nick Bockwinkel's not part of the NWA. This is an AWA champion. So
yes.
the fact that he brought in Nick Bockwinkel there, that was a big red flag.
Which is interesting, too, because now that we're tying back to Vern Gagne, because if people don't realize, when Vern split from the NWA, formed the AWA, right? So we talked about their relationship, whatever it was, in, the late 40s, early 50s. Fast forward 30 years, Vern's champion is touring Calgary. It's incredible.
Yeah. I think in some ways, because maybe being the redheaded stepchild of the NWA, which maybe he was, I think that also gave Stu maybe a little bit of freedom as well. Because, for example, he would always, he brought in Andre the Giant. And as far as I know, Andre the Giant worked under contract with the McMahon family.
He was under contract with the WWF at that point. Yeah, he was under contract with the WWF at that point.
Yeah. However, I guess they did contract it. Andre certainly showed up in NWA territories then, not just Stu's. So maybe that was sort of just because Andre the Giant was such an attraction, the WWF would perhaps contract him out to the other territories. That makes sense to me, I guess.
If I'm not mistaken,
that he had a certain flexibility maybe that other sort of bigger NWA territories might not have had.
Yeah, and the other thing about Andre is I want to say at that point the WWF was still a part of the NWA. I could be wrong. Maybe that had ended at that point, but even still, Stu's getting dates on him because and see, this is where my WWF knowledge is not where it needs to be. But if I'm not mistaken, it was something where you could buy dates on Andre through the office, so you would get a list of weeks of availability. So whether it was Japan asking or whether it was Stampede asking, whatever, you had these blocks of dates, and you would pay whatever the fee was for that entire set, and he would come out and do the program.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, the big one for me was when Bockwinkel showed up, and it was a big deal. For weeks they were promoting Bockwinkel, and I only knew Bockwinkel at that time as a kid just from the magazines, So I was just so excited that Nick Bockwinkel was coming, and he fought David Schultz, and I think he fought maybe Bret Hart, and they really did bring in, promote the coming of Nick Bockwinkel and AWA guys. So and that was after a dearth of champions coming, because I'm not sure when the last time Race came, but I think it had been a few years. So and Race had a great relationship with Stu. Race actually, I think Race because had so much respect for Stu, he would go a little over and above. Like at one point there, when he'd actually do the entire Stampede tour. Like he'd go to Saskatoon and all the little towns in between, sort of thing. And there's one story, I think maybe Bret Hart tells it in his book. There's one story about how they went to some little town, and the ring never showed up. So there was some mishap, and the ring never showed up. So they had to actually just wrestle on a gym mat.
Yes, I do remember that story.
Yeah, and Race was willing. He was the world champion at that time. A lot of guys would have just said, say it was a WWF thing. There's no way Hulk Hogan's wrestling on a gym mat.
No.
But
Doesn't work for me, brother.
Yeah, Race probably wouldn't have done it for just anybody either, but he had such respect for Stu that he was willing to do that.
About Harley Race, I want to say 79 was the last time that he would have been there as a champion, although I'm sure he made dates after, obviously not with the NWA title.
Yeah, he did, and at one point there was a cross-promotional show with the WWF. This goes into the late 80s, and he showed up as the King Harley Race.
Yes, that's right.
So he had come back. But in the Stampede Wrestling as territory days, he was it 79. It was as late as 79. I wouldn't have thought that, but okay, yeah, that makes sense actually.
So you were talking earlier about the ups and the big ups and big downs for Stampede Wrestling for Stu Hart as well. Here's a date. I'm going to tell you the date, and I want to get your reaction. December 2nd, 1980. Yeah, I can see by you can't see the video obviously on the podcast portion, but as soon as I said the date, his face lit up. December 2nd, 1983 was probably the most infamous day in Calgary Stampede Stampede wrestling history.
It is infamous. It was an amazing time. I remember watching it as a kid, and it was it's essentially the wrestling version of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. If you're
yes.
If the audience there is familiar with War of the Worlds, it's just this fiction that's perpetrated on on the public that it's so realistic that everybody buys it and they think it's real, and it creates this hysteria. This is what happened in December 2nd, 1983. Yeah.
So
I can basically this was something that Bruce Hart promoted actually. This is a concept Bruce had come up with. The killer, fearsome, terrifying monster heel of that time, that early 80s period in Stampede Wrestling was Bad News Allen. He was just terrifying. He torn through the Dynamite Kid. He torn through Bret Hart. He had this big, intimidating, loud, angry presence when he would be on TV. He was just a terrifying heel of his day. And they had the concept to bring in the terrifying heel of yesteryear, which was Archie the Stomper Goldie, who was like just this huge heel in the late 60s and early 70s in Stampede, and bring him in and pit them against each other. It was going to be this King Kong versus Godzilla situation. But first, they brought them in as a team. They brought them in as this tag team, and the whole conceit was that Archie the Stomper was going to bring his kid with him, his young green kid, Jeff Goldie. It wasn't really his kid, but they brought in this
kid, yeah.
Yeah, kayfabe. They brought in this guy that was supposedly the son of Archie the Stomper Goldie, Jeff Goldie, who he's breaking his son Jeff into the business, and he's going to team up with Bad News Allen. And it was a legend. It was an amazing match, and that Bad News Allen had such heat. The crowd hated him. They were terrified of him. They hated him, and so it was. I believe it was Bret Hart, Davey Boy Smith, and this Japanese wrestler who they were passing off as a First Nations wrestler
was Sonny Two Rivers. Yes.
Yeah, Sonny. He was good, and I used to love watching him. And so there was those three against Archie the Stomper, Jeff Goldie, and Bad News Allen. At one point in the match, Bad News Allen turns on Archie the Stomper. He does the heel turn, betrays him, stabs him in the back essentially. Another wrestler, Terry Brown, comes in, and one of the managers, Wakamatsu, and they wind up tying Archie the Stomper up in the corner, essentially, knocking him out, tying him up. And Archie the Stomper takes Jeff Goldie out throws him out of the ring, pile drives him on the concrete in front of the ring, and the crowd goes and supposedly cripples him. That was the whole thing.
They did an ambulance angle out of this.
Yeah, the ambulance comes in. They broke his neck. The crowd, and it was such an amazing thing the way they pulled it off. But the crowd went absolutely bananas. You can see a bit of it on YouTube. There was actually a riot. Some old man hit Bad News Allen with his cane, and Allen actually grabbed him by the throat and throttled him. And he goes, "Don't you touch me, you old bastard!" And it was this crazy thing. The crowd went absolutely nuts. And the Harts, they never clued. Here was a big way they went wrong. They never clued Ed Whalen, the announcer, in on this. And Ed Whalen often headbutted with the Harts and fought with the Harts because he wanted wrestling to be family entertainment. When it got too violent, he threatened to walk on many occasions, and he would always edit the violent stuff off TV, and he'd really fight a lot with Bruce Hart about this kind of stuff. So anyway, there's a riot in the Victoria Pavilion. Archie, Bad News Allen comes out and does this terrifying promo about he's taunting the Stomper. I crippled your kid. I helped him die. It was just riveting. And the crowd, as I say, the crowd's just going bananas. And then at the end of it, everybody's cleared out, and just the Stomper comes in there. It's Archie the Stomper and Ed Whalen. A little spotlight on the ring. The whole Victoria Pavilion's dark. They're the only two guys there in the Victoria Pavilion. And Stomper's also this loud, intimidating, psychopath on the mic usually. This time he's somber. He's sad. He's expressing regret that he brought his son into this horrible wrestling business. Now his son's a cripple and all this. And then at the end, he vows revenge on Bad News Allen. And it was such an amazing scenario. It's one of the greatest wrestling moments of all time that nobody else outside of Stampede Wrestling knows about. The Stu's territory knows about, but it was an incredible moment. And Ed Whalen, this was the kicker here at the end of it. Ed Whalen says, "I can't be a part of this anymore." He tells the audience he quits. He quits right there on the air and kind of hangs his mic over the ropes, and he leaves. Ed Whalen is, like I say, he's the star of the show. And because Ed did that as well, everybody buys what had happened. The media went nuts. Like the media started attacking Stampede Wrestling. It's gotten too violent. Wrestling's got to be stopped. The Calgary Boxing and Wrestling Commission, who Stu's often over the years has been at odds with for violence and stuff, they take away his license, so he can't operate Calgary shows for a while. I think it affects his TV license at one point there, so he starts having there's a First Nations reserve outside of Calgary, Susina. So he has to do a couple matches there. So what should have been this amazing moment for Stampede Wrestling becomes that Bad News Allen gets fined, Stu gets fined, and then they're getting attacked by the media. Helen Hart's, begging Stu, like, "Stu, let's get out of this business."
Yes.
She's been begging for years, but now she really steps it up. It's like, "Stu, we need to get out of this business. This is terrible." So he's losing money. He's under all this pressure, and this is when this leads to at a time when they should have been really strong, they're now weakened. And that's exactly around the time that Vince McMahon comes knocking on the door. That's when he's expanding the WWF and, mowing over all the other territories and taking over people's TV spots and poaching their stars and everything. And here he comes knocking on Stampede Wrestling's door, and he wants to do the same. And he's offering Stu to buy out the territory.
So before we get...
Because Stu's still weakened, he's willing at this time to do it.
So and this is something that I'm really interested to get your take on is the quote-unquote purchase by the WWF. But before we get there, I just want to or reiterate or really hammer down the December 2nd, 1983 could have set that entire territory of the Stampede Wrestling off for years and years and years. They could have built how many different programs? Well, they were building how many different programs based off this angle, and two oversights: one not queuing in Ed Whalen, and then there was unfortunately a fan I believe was trampled in the riot as well. So that
I forgot about that. Yeah, right.
So this amazing feat that they pull off of keeping it under wraps and the heat from the crowd and just how everything transpired for all of it to really be the thing that caused the downfall of Stampede Wrestling is incredible. And it's again one of those things that if you didn't know or didn't hear about it, it's you hear about it nowadays and it's fans don't get that crazy. Like fans nowadays don't get that crazy. It's hard to fathom, right? Yes and no. If you've ever seen a Canadian fan base at whether it's an NHL game or a CFL game or whatever, right? A goddamn kids soccer game, we have a propensity for being a little bit involved in the happenings, if you will. So 100%, if you're seeing essentially what you think is a guy getting murdered with a pile driver on a concrete floor and he's getting taken out on a stretcher, and this is in a territory, Stampede Wrestling, where it was very real, right? There was very little theatrics to the wrestling itself.
No, especially with a guy like the Bad News Allen matches were so intense. So the way he would just destroy people, and the Dynamite Kid was another. Like he was such an incredible performer, and he would make everything just look like a cartoon come to life. So he would fly across the ring, whether he's flying off the turnbuckle onto somebody or whether somebody's hit him and he goes flying off like he's just been shot to the moon. Like it was very. But it looked realistic. It didn't look theatrical. It looked like a real brawl.
No, Davey Boy too as well, but Dynamite Kid doing flips is not the flips that people are used to seeing nowadays in wrestling. That's for sure.
No.
So,
yeah.
WWF comes in. Obviously, Stu is at a low point financially, physically, emotionally, and he makes the decision to and I use this phrase, quote unquote, sell to the WWF.
Yeah, because it wasn't much of a sell.
Yes. Okay, so there's been a ton of debate back and forth. Was it a sale? Was it not a sale? Was there money exchanged? What have you been able to determine?
The way I understand it, he was going to buy. Vince offered to buy the territory for $1 million. A few caveats: he would take some of Stu's top stars with him to the WWF. Brett, Jim Neidhart, and the British Bulldogs, and then he also had his eye, and later got Bad News Allen and people like that. But the deal was, the financial deal was that it was going to be $1 million, $100,000 a year for 10 years. And then Stu would have a piece of the gate. He would get a percentage of the gate in Calgary and Edmonton shows, as I understand it. And whether that first $100,000 exchanged hands, that I'm not clear about that, actually. I imagine it probably did. But in terms of, basically, Vince reneged on the deal because Calgary fans were so passionate about Stampede Wrestling, and they were actually appalled by the coming of the WWF. And the first WWF shows in Calgary were poorly attended and very poorly received because suddenly, these fans that grew up with Stampede Wrestling, they're suddenly watching, suddenly Bret Hart showing up as a heel all of a sudden. And he had been one of the great golden, baby faces. Suddenly he's showing up as a heel, and then some of the lower card guys that were still beloved in Stampede Wrestling, like the Leo Burks and the Mr. Hitos and people like that. Suddenly they're showing up on the bottom of the card, just getting squashed by the WWF guys. And they hated it. The Calgary fans really hated it and resisted it at first. And suddenly Vince, what he thought was this golden territory, didn't look so golden to him anymore. And so he said to Stu, I'm not paying the rest of this. I'm not, the deal's off. And so, but at that point there, Stu had given up his TV, he'd given up the TV show and, turned over, WWF had the TV spots, and he lost his top guys. So he had to, so in 85, he decided with pressure, I think Bruce was really the one driving it, but Bruce wanted to start up Stampede Wrestling again. But so they started it up again, and I think Stu was torn about it. I think Stu wanted to be back in the wrestling business, but he was getting a little old, and he always had Helen on him saying, please don't go back into this, But then he had Bruce saying to him, we got to get back into this business, So anyways, he gets back in 85, and he's torn about it. I think he wanted to be there, but he didn't want to be there. If that makes sense.
I think and maybe I'm totally speaking off base here, but it might have been one of those situations where, he made the sale, he was, emotionally divested of it now, right now, so he's out of the game.
That makes sense to me.
And then when you're out of something totally like that, when your time's up, you're retired, you're finished, you're going to move on to the next chapter, whatever that might be, it's hard to, kind of throw yourself back, and especially if Helen's not with him on it, that couldn't have been easy.
No, it really wasn't. I think it was tough on him, and then also, Bruce was sort of steering it into the future there. And Stu didn't like the way Bruce was steering it into the future. He thought he thought a lot of Bruce's ideas were too crackpotish, and he thought that Bruce had some great ideas. A lot of people, kind of crap on Bruce, and Bruce did do, all Bruce ideas weren't gold, but he was really essential to, he brought this sort of crazy sensibility to Stampede Wrestling in the late 70s and right through the 80s that I think made Stampede Wrestling really stand out. But Stu didn't like a lot of those ideas, and Stu was still really buddy with Ed Whalen, who did come back to the show, by the way. And Ed Whalen still wanted it to be family stuff, and he didn't want the violence. And Stu backed Ed Whalen on that for the most part. And Bruce was the one always pushing for the violence, pushing for the. Stu hated nut shots. Bruce loved guys getting hit in the nuts.
Yeah.
That was one of his things he loved to do, and Stu hated it. So that was one of the things. He was always mad about Bruce and those nut shots and violence. And just some of the some of the kind of show crazier sort of theme ideas that Bruce came up with. Stu didn't always buy into that stuff. So, so that's another thing too. He was sort of half in and half out, and he's just battling with Bruce over the way it was going to go, and not loving the way Bruce was steering the ship. So
when they finally they never finally shut it down, but in the late 80s, that would have been 88, 89 into 90 is when I think that that they shut it down finally. But if I'm not mistaken, Stu was still training out of the dungeon at that point, correct?
A little bit. Like I don't think he was there all the time or anything like that. I think it was mostly the brothers that were doing it at that time. Keith, Bruce, Ross. But yeah, Stu, but people well into even a couple of years before Stu died, there's stories of people being down in the dungeon, and Stu would come down there and, stretch him and show him. He loved being an old guy and being underestimated by people, and then showing him that he still had it. And
okay, I'm trying to think here.
What stretched me once, and I'm glad, and I'm glad I didn't take him up on it.
It's funny you say that, because I've heard like guys like Jim Ross or whatever talk about they're at the Hart house for whatever reason, there to grab bread or talk business or whatever, and there'd be Stu in the corner. Hey, you want to go in the dungeon? It was just.
The time he offered to do it to me, the weirdest. It sounds weird, but it was the day I was there for the death of Owen Hart. Like, I was there in the Hart house, and I met Stu, and I talked to him about Owen and stuff, and I got my quotes from him, and he was obviously shattered and everything, but he was also hospitable, and I was from Saskatoon. Stu was born right outside of Saskatoon, so he had ties with Saskatoon. Ed Whalen was a Saskatoon boy and stuff, so he liked that I was from Saskatoon, and he kind of, I don't know, half jokingly, or he offered to take me down into the dungeon and show me a few things, and I knew and I was like, no, it's okay. I'm here. I'm just here to work. I'm just a reporter here to work. And I think it was just instinctual for him. And I think maybe he was in such pain that day that it might have been just a bit of a relief to take somebody down into the dungeon and stretch him. I think that was his happy place, And that sounds odd on the day after his son had died, but that's what he said to me.
It's funny you mentioned that. Like, what year did Wrestling with Shadows come out? Was that 98?
I think Wrestling with Shadows, if I'm not mistaken, was 97. I might be wrong.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Well, there was most of the filming was done in 97.
Yeah.
For sure, right? And I'll never forget the videos of Stu stretching guys in the basement, and so you figure that's only 3 years, before you're meeting him, and he's still ready to go in the dungeon. Man.
It was something.
So as you were writing the book, and as you were getting to know the family, and know Stu as well, what was your sense of him as maybe not a personality, but what was your sense of what he thought of his perception in society?
I don't know if he was so aware of the impact. Like, if you go to the Glenville Museum in Calgary right now, there's a display dedicated to Stu Hart. A picture of him and the old North American title belt. I don't know. So it's like this Mavericks. It's called Mavericks, and it's a display of the 100 most influential people in Calgary history.
Okay.
And I don't know. I mean, I knew I think he had some sense that he was, he had made an impact, and he was a name. He was a known commodity and a known person in Calgary. But I don't know. He seemed like a humble guy, and I don't think he would have seen himself being, in a Mavericks display with the most influential Calgarians of all time.
And the Hart House still stands today, as correct?
It does. I just visited it recently, just from the outside. Like, it's not owned by the Harts anymore.
No,
it's terrible that it's not, but it's owned by somebody else. So the outside looks exactly like it always looked. So you go up there and drive up to it, and it's something to see. But on the inside, from what I'm told, it's very different now. They had, because it's a heritage home, they had to maintain the facade, but the inside they could do with it whatever. So I don't know if it's offices now or if there's just a family there. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I was just going to ask because of the heritage designation, what that meant for what's preserved and what can be, changed or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I was there. I know, and that's another thing that tore up the Hart family too. Like, after Owen died, I mean, they were always the Hart family, the 12 kids, and they all, and they're in this sort of showbiz world, and they all have some aspirations to get into the wrestling business or in some way or another, or they all wound up part of the wrestling business in some way or another, and so and just any family with 12 kids, I think there's a lot of backbiting and a lot of scrapping and fighting, especially with a scrappy family like the Hart family. So they always had sort of there was little, kind of cliques within the family and stuff, and certain brothers and sisters not getting along and stuff. But then, of course, after Owen died, it absolutely tears them apart. Because some people backed the suing of Vince McMahon and the WWF, and some were against it, and things got very, very ugly, and it tore the family apart. And then these rivalries continue, like, because they all fought about what to do with the house. Some people thought that the Hart family should keep it, and some thought they should turn it into a museum of some sort, and then others thought, no, we got to unload this thing. And so even then. When would that sale have been? Around 2005 or something, I think. Maybe not that early. But anyway, I know that they were still, battling over it stuff even then.
So obviously, after Owen's passing, just can you speak to just this? I don't know if state is the correct way to phrase it, but just what was Stu's kind of outlook on not wrestling, but the family aspect? Because I keep wanting to cue in on that because I think it's so interesting. Just what was his biggest, if you know, I'm not sure if you do, his biggest frustration or regret or complication with the family? What was the big stumbling block for him?
Like when the lawsuit was happening against Matt?
Even after the lawsuit, just was he a big proponent of trying to get the family back together? Was he trying to get everybody on the same?
And I think he was absolutely. Him and Helen were both absolutely brokenhearted that the family, that their family had been torn apart to that extreme, to that degree.
So as we move on with the program, what if you could name like a top 3 lasting moments or lasting memories of Stu Hart, either your interaction with him or something that you would have witnessed in Calgary Stampede? If you had a top 3, what would they be?
When I was growing up and watching it, live in real time sort of thing, Stu was already sort of the old guy, the patriarch that was sort of off in the background, right? So I didn't see a lot of his greatest matches, or just watched him later in tapes and stuff like that. So it's a little hard for me, but I would say like my top 3 Stu Hart sort of moments that sum him up: the stuff in the dungeon, the people he trained in the dungeon and the people he tortured in the dungeons, and the horror stories that come out of the dungeon. I'd say that. I'd say the battles that he had with Archie the Stomper were absolutely epic. Archie the Stomper Goldie was a guy that he was his greatest prodigy, perhaps, in the dungeon, that he trained from scratch and brought him up there. And then they went on to have these amazing battles. And I guess just being this patriarch of this family that went on to be so influential in wrestling history. And Bret Hart's one of the most famous wrestlers one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. And and so is Owen, and Owen's one of the greatest tragedies of all time as well. And just the fact that he spawned this, and for me, the fact that he's the creator of this amazing thing that I grew up with, it means so much to me and so much to so many people that I grew, for generations in Western Canada, especially. That's my top. That's Stu for me. That's the thing that means most to me about Stu Hart. I don't know if that's a good answer for you, because I don't have a lot of specific matches to tell you about or anything like that. And I know that he had some great moments in the ring, but they were sort of before my time, a lot of them. So
no, that's what I wanted to hit on. It's not the matches, it's the man, right? Yeah. And it's again the interesting dichotomy between Stu Hart, wrestling promoter, Stu Hart the father, Stu Hart the family man. And I find it just fascinating, just that, obviously the dungeon is one that most people are going to bring to, but then your other ones are, about the man behind everything. And I think that's very apropos.
Very much so. And also that he did a lot for charity whenever, and, he was often struggling himself, but he's known for a lot of the charities initiatives he would support in Calgary as well. So that's something you really have to remember him for. And I just also think of him as this inspiring guy in the way that he built himself up from nothing. Like, he grew up just dirt poor.
Yeah, the poorest of poor, yeah.
His father was locked in a land dispute. When he was a kid, a young boy, Stu lived in a tent outside of a property that his father felt he had claim to. He lived in his tent, in a frozen Canadian prairie. We're talking -30, -40 weather here. He lived in a tent with his two sisters and his mom and dad. And he came from that. He lived that way for 2 years. It's unfathomable. I don't know how you survive that, and it just but he was so strong that he did survive it. And then the fact that he comes from that and just builds himself up to this level where he's this, legendary figure. That's something that really sticks out for me for Stu Hart too.
So as we wrap up this segment of the program, Heath, where can people get in touch with you?
I'm Van Heathen on Twitter. I mean, I'm pretty much out of the journalism business at the moment. I mean, I've thought about cooking up another book and doing some magazine stories, but at the moment I'm the father of 4, and so I'm not.
Time is a premium.
Yeah, I'm sort of past that phase of my life at the moment, but I'm not writing it off that I'll never get back into the journalism world or the book writing world or anything like that. But Van Heathen on Twitter, I guess, and the main thing is I want everybody to buy my book. I think that it's I didn't write it just for wrestling fans. It's a really epic, tragic sort of story. I wrote it I had a cinematic vision for it. And I always wanted it to be a crossover sort of book, like the way the Wrestler movie was a crossover.
Yes.
You didn't have to be a wrestling fan to like that movie. That's sort of what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be something that wrestling fans would love, and especially people that grew up with Stampede Wrestling, because I knew it would tug at their heartstrings. But I wanted it to be more of a crossover hit too. I wanted people to, because it's just a family. It's a tragedy and it's a family story. It's an epic family tragedy. And so Amazon, ecwpress.com, and and Amazon, you can still buy it. So yeah.
Pain and Passion.
Find me through my book.
Yes, Pain and Passion: The History of Stampede Wrestling. We're gonna have more on that book a little bit later as well. But until then, Heath, thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm sorry for taking up an exponential amount of your time. I have 4 kids. I got 2 myself, and they are a handful. So I very much appreciate having you on the program.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for your interest. It was a great to chat with you.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll have something to pique your interest and get you on the program in the near future. But until then, thank you very much for joining the program tonight.
Thank you.
Before we head to the finish of this evening's program, we're going to play some classic audio once again from Stampede Wrestling. Now, this audio is from the riot that we talked about early in the program with Heath and myself, the one where Bad News Allen turns on Archie the Goldie Stomper. Now, you're going to hear Ed Whalen, the often opinionated, often involved Ed Whalen, essentially go silent. Now, this is directly related to what we were talking about earlier in the program. that Ed Whalen had no foreknowledge that this was going to happen. You're going to hear the crowd essentially go silent because they have no idea what they're witnessing. It's such a shock to everybody involved. Ed Whalen, the fans, even some of the boys, because nobody was clued in to what was actually happening in the ring that evening. But you're gonna hear the turn. You're gonna hear Ed Whalen essentially go silent, and then you're gonna hear the interview with Bad News Allen after, where you want to talk about heat in a building. Oh boy, you're gonna hear it in this one. So we're gonna get into this classic audio, and then we're gonna head to the end of the program on the other side of it.
Gonna turn him, Indian Deathlock. He's working on the Indian Deathlock. He's got it on him. He's got him on it. The Indian Deathlock was broken up by Stopper. Stopper in the ring illegally. It's Sonny Two Rivers in the corner, tags, and Bad News Allen comes in. He hit the stopper. Bad News Allen hit the stopper. Stopper jammed in this corner. Kerry Brown has got him wrapped up, and Bad News Allen is going against the stopper. Bad News Allen now takes a run at young Jeff Goldie. Going after Jeff Goldie, flings him out of there. Kerry Brown joins him in front of the ring. So busy jawing with the crowd. I've never seen anything like that.
Let me tell you something. Archer, the stopper Goldie, I've been planning this for a long time. You've been running your mouth that you wanted my belt. You wanted the championship from me, but you thought tagging up with me was going to make me to forget the vendetta I had for you. Put the camera over there and take a look at this man. Take a look at him. Take a look at his son there. I broke his neck. I crippled him. I helped the son of a gun die. Look at this outfit.
As we begin to wrap up the program this evening, there's just a few things I wanted to touch on about Stu Hart before we kind of close out this podcast this evening. Now, there is no way that I would be able to go into complete granular detail about Stu Hart, the man, Stu Hart, the promoter, Stu Hart, the family man, etc. It would be a 20-hour podcast for sure, at least. But at the very least, I'm very proud of the guests that I had on and of the research that we did to kind of give everybody a snapshot, closer look at Stu Hart, the man, Stu Hart, the promoter. I hope that we gave you guys all some valuable information that you never knew. And really what I wanted this to be is kind of a jumping off point for you, the listener, to take the time to research the man, Stu Hart, to research Calgary Stampede Wrestling, and more importantly, to kind of immerse yourself in the history of Western Canadian wrestling. And like I said previously in the program, no better way to do that than the book written by the aforementioned Heath McCoy, which you can find the link to on tinyurl.com/grapplingwithcanada. Before I get out of here tonight, I just want to highlight Stu Hart's accomplishments and championships, and then we're going to unfortunately talk about the end of his life. Now, that's a subject nobody likes to talk about, but as great men once said, Father Time does no jobs. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about his championships and accomplishments. So in amateur wrestling, he won the Edmonton City Middleweight Championship in 1930, won the Alberta Provincial Championship in 1930, won the Western Canada Championship and the Canadian National Wrestling Championships in 1939, won the Dominion Welterweight Championship in 1937 and the Dominion Light Heavyweight Championship in 1940. He won the Welterweight Championship from the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada in 1937. He went into the Alberta Sports Hall of Fame. He was inducted in the class of 1980 and also went into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame class of 2008. Now, in terms of just professional wrestling itself, he was inducted in the Canadian Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, the class of 1980. He was inducted in the Cauliflower Alley Club in 2001. He was inducted in the Lou Thez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in the class of 2008. And in terms of championships that he won the NWA Northwest Tag Team Championship twice with Pat Meehan and Luigi Massera. He was inducted in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, the class of 2014. He was inducted in the Stampede Wrestling Hall of Fame, the class of 1995. In WWE, he was inducted in their Hall of Fame in 2010. He was inducted in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame class of 1996. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure somebody will on Twitter. You can send your hate tweets to @6_podcast. But anyways, I'm sure that he was part of the inaugural class of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. Just shows what an incredible reach that he had, that an American news writer like Dave Meltzer would take the time to induct him in the first ever class of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. He was also inducted as well, lastly, in the Prairie Alliance Wrestling Hall of Fame. In terms of recognitions, he was a recipient of the Order of Canada in November 15th, 2000. Now, that's the highest honor that any civilian could ever be bestowed upon in Canada in terms of an award. Just a tremendous legacy, a tremendous honor for Stu, and I'm sure that he, with my conversation with Heath, he's very humble. I'm sure that he kind of, downplayed it or whatever, but my God, it must have been such a thrill for him to receive that recognition from Canada, just of the absolute importance that he had to the fabric of our country. Now, unfortunately, we have to talk about the way that his life ended. So, in 2003, he was admitted with an elbow infection. He also developed pneumonia as part of his hospital stay. Whether or not it was part of I shouldn't say that, but it was pneumonia that he got as a result of an elbow infection. He also suffered from diabetes and arthritis. Unfortunately, he also suffered a stroke during his hospital day and passed away on October 16th of 2003. He was 88 years old at the time. What a tremendous life, what a tremendous man, what a tremendous part of Canadian history. Not just wrestling, but Canadian history, and I can't overstate that enough. For myself, the legacy of Stu Hart is somebody who persevered through enormous personal struggles, somebody who strived very hard to be a very good family man and provide for his family, tried to be a good father to 12 children, tried to be a good husband to his wife. And to me, that's my takeaway from it. Forget the wrestling side of it. Forget what he did for Stampede. Forget what he did for Western Canadian wrestling. Forget what he did for the NWA. To me, Stu Hart, in my opinion, is one of the greatest figures in Canadian history because of who he was as a person. That's my opinion. I hope that everybody can take their own perspectives and their own ideas away from these conversations that I had with the guests on this program tonight. As we start to wrap up the program this evening, I just want to encourage everybody once again to visit our website, tinyurl.com/Grappling With Canada. Once again, I know I've shilled it about 50,000 times on the program tonight, but I can't say it enough. You are doing yourself a disservice if you do not go out and get Pain and Passion, written by Heath McCoy, on Stampede Wrestling. It's the most incredible read. If you think that listening to this program and you hear things like the car accident that he had, or his time in the Navy, or, the riot of Stampede Wrestling, or all that, if you think that all that sounds too fantastical to be true, just you are not sure what you're in for when you get to read that book. So highly encourage that everybody go check that out. Once again, I want to thank all of the guests that I had on the program tonight. Ashley Rose Nova, Danny Duggan, the Hotshot, if you will, and of course Heath McCoy. Once again, you can find us at tinyurl.com/Grappling With Canada. On there as well, I didn't mention this yet, we have our Patreon page, patreon.com/Grappling With Canada. There's a few tiers on there. If you are able and willing to help out the show, that would be very much appreciated. Once again, you can also find us on YouTube using that wonderful YouTube search bar, Grappling with Canada, or you can use the direct search youtube.com/c/six-sided podcast. And we're also marching our way to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, and when we hit that mark, I have a very special prize pack for one lucky winner, which will include a copy of Pain and Passion, the book written by Heath McCoy that I've been plugging and shilling on this program. You can also interact with me on Twitter at @6_podcast. Once again, for all my guests, thank you all very much for tuning into the program tonight. Without you, I'm not going to say there's not a point to doing this, because the point of doing this is to talk about the history of Canadian professional wrestling, because if we don't talk about it, if we don't investigate it, if we don't research it, if we don't look into it, unfortunately it goes by the wayside, and I, for one, refuse to let that happen. So, on behalf of all of my guests, for myself, the Taxman, I will leave you as I used to leave everyone on the previous Six-Sided Podcast program. Take care of yourselves and each other. Happy 2021, everyone, and we'll catch you on next month's episode.